So my thought process has been like all these people bouncing into my life. It's not really been about me helping them. It's about them, right, them helping me.
Why are we sitting here trying to figure out how to clean up the mess of someone's splattered psyche?
If the issue is really extreme, why does it have to be really extreme? Can't I live like a beautiful, joyful life, and anything less than that is really extreme?
Like, I think the capacity to acknowledge and be humbled and come to a point of realizing, like, I cannot get out of here myself, I need help. Like, that is a pivotal point in people's recovery.
Welcome to the In Search of More podcast. I am your host, Eli Nash. Join me weekly on my quest for more from myself and more from this world. We'll see you on the other side.
Welcome.
Hello.
Hello. I'm sitting here with, I never struggled so much on someone's name. I'm sitting here with Divi Bogart, also known as Divi Kamman. Professionally, you go more by your maiden name.
Right.
Okay, so that's who we're talking about. When we say Divi Bogart or Divi Kamman, this is who we are speaking about. Divi is a psychiatric nurse practitioner,
right,
with a background working specifically with people with eating disorders, but now that has grown way beyond that. Understand?
Yeah.
You Yale trained, for those that's
meaningful
a perk. Too. You've learned a little Chassidus, for those that's meaningful too. And we met. So how did we meet? We met because Avremi Garari mentioned your name to me, right? Avremi Garari, who some may know. One day he'll probably be sitting on that chair.
It's coming.
But it's coming. We don't have the date set, but I'm sure he'll be there. Avremi Garari introduced us. And then I think there was a conversation we were having. I don't remember which one. It was one of the webinars, early pandemic, that I was hosting. And you were chatting a lot. You remember that?
I was texting into the audience chat.
Right. Do you remember what the conversation was, what the subject was? I don't remember.
Chassidus and healing?
No, that was one you joined, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it came up in the initial conversation, and I had some feedback.
Oh, right. That's what happened. I was having conversation with Simon Jacobson, Rabbi Simon Jacobson, about the intersection of Chassidus and healing.
Yeah.
And you were chatting, and we said, hey, why don't we do this again?
Right.
And the three of us will talk. I think there was another conversation you also participated in. That was one on ketamine therapy.
Yeah, we did that with Stephen Radowitz.
Right.
Yeah. I've also moved kind of outside of ketamine too, if you want to talk about that here today.
We'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. We'll talk about everything. But you also have experience in ketamine therapy.
Right.
Okay, so I do want to go into some of that stuff, ketamine and psychedelics, but my concern is that if we go there, we may not come out.
We might not.
So that is the concern of psychedelics, right, in general, not like the conversation.
Right. Pardes.
What?
If you go into Pardes.
Is Pardes psychedelics the same thing?
It has some.
Probably.
We could learn some things from that story.
Right. So Pardes is a well-known story of 4 rabbis.
Right.
They say went into
the
Pardes, whatever the Pardes is. And I think one.
The garden. I know that. I don't actually know what happened to all of them. But one went crazy,
one died, one something else happened. Yeah, one became a heretic. And I think, and then one
came out in peace.
One came out okay, in peace.
Yeah. The interesting thing about the one who came out in peace is it says he went in peace. He entered in peace and he exited in peace. So
what do you take from that?
Could learn from that. When we talk about going into territory that can be destabilizing or shift your reality in some major way, that the way to leave in peace is to go in peace. So what I take from that personally is peace in Hebrew is shalom, right? And peace is the capacity to hold paradox. Right? Like when you can hold paradox, there's peace, right? When you can't tolerate paradox, there's conflict.
Right.
So if you're in a place where you can
Meaning peace suggests that there's 2 opposing forces. I hear that. And then there's peace between those opposing forces.
Exactly.
Good.
So
I like it.
It's like within a person, if you can go into an experience in a place where within your being, you're capable of holding opposites without getting scrambled, then you'll be good. So it's like people think, how do I emerge from this experience in a more healed place, right? The question is, how do I enter this experience? That's the important part, right?
But it's not going to come from a more healed place, because the person is coming in often because they're struggling.
Right. So that's the tricky part, right? How do you take a person or empower a person who's struggling to enter an experience like that in a place of peace? So it's not going to be perfect, but that's the intention, right? Preparation, some would say, for an experience like that is to build some skills and a foundation where there is a basic capacity to hold paradox. I mean, what does holding paradox mean practically in a person? It's holding contradicting emotions, right? I mean, one of the main reasons we get frazzled is because we aren't comfortable being with opposing emotions at the same time.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, sure. It's like this morning, right? Like I'm feeling some excitement about doing this conversation. I'm also feeling some feeling of overwhelm about being in a new place and not feeling settled. And if I allow myself to get frazzled by that contradiction, I won't be present here, right? But the moment I'm totally welcoming of that contradiction, and I'm like, of course, it makes sense that I'm both excited and unsettled in a new place, then there's a settling in my system.
A peace.
Yeah.
Shalom.
Shalom. Shalom. My brother-in-law started a program for Jewish people with eating disorders. He called it Bish Shalom.
Bish Shalom.
Yes.
So let's talk about eating disorders because, like I said, if we go to psychedelic route, I think we'll be there the whole time. What is it about my senses, and I may be wrong on this, but my sense is that when someone's challenges have like really entered the realm of eating disorder, which many people have an unhealthy relationship with food, but I'm talking about severe disordered eating.
Mm-hmm.
There's a level of healing that is required that seems to require complexity that some other things don't. And
Right.
Just before I go to eating, I would say something similarly with sex.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say in comparison to alcohol or drugs, I've seen many people who've been able to work out an unhealthy relationship with drugs or alcohol,
Right.
but really get stymied by an unhealthy relationship with sex. To put it in practical terms, people who are 20 years sober in Alcoholics Anonymous and cannot figure out how to get 30 days sober from a sex addiction. And then eating seems to go cut like a level below.
Even deeper.
Even deeper.
Without getting too Freudian, like, doesn't it make common sense? Because it's like when you're in an addiction with a substance outside of yourself, right? That's your way of coping. You found something in the external world that gives you temporary relief, right? Allows you to be consumed by it, and you no longer have to be in your reality for that time. But when you're struggling with an addiction that involves sexuality or eating, the addiction is within yourself. It's like you've found a way to use your own body to be in an addictive loop with your own being.
So can you make that same jump from sex to eating and why eating would be more than sex?
Yeah, because sexuality evolves later than autonomous capacity to feed oneself. Like the capacity to feed oneself is mastered really early in healthy development. 2, 3, right? The capacity to be whole sexually is mastered much later. So it's a very early, primitive, young process that's gotten disrupted in disordered eating.
So you're saying that when someone has disordered eating, you'll be able to go back to 2, 3 years old to the onset of disordered eating?
I've seen that play out in people's deep trauma healing when there's a eating disorder present, that it goes really deep. I was sitting with a young woman who described her eating disorder, and she was sharing what she was going through. And she's like, I don't know why, but I feel like I was breastfed sour milk. Like, those were her words. And I had a similar experience in some of my experiences in recovery of going to that age where you're actually recalling what it was like to taste breast milk and that first earliest relationship, which is interesting because in Freudian psychology and like Melanie Klein, there was so much emphasis on like the breast and what that meant to the child. And it seems like even though in some ways some of their ways of working are somewhat outdated, like we come back to those truths. So, yeah, I think you're going really early if you're healing it deeply. But I would say that sometimes people get confused because eating disorders is so broad. Like, just because someone is struggling with their relationship with food, it does not necessarily mean they have a trauma that happened before the age of 2, right? Someone can be struggling with their relationship with food for so many different reasons, especially in our society, right? Like, sometimes it can be a relatively normal stage in development where they're figuring themselves out and they're experimenting with maybe different ways of eating or ways of changing or shifting their body.
So can we define it a little bit? When we say eating disorder or disordered eating, what are we talking about? Undereating, overeating, everything in between?
Everything. I think we all pretty much need healing in our relationship with food and our physical bodies. Like, it seems that it's actually really prevalent, the amount of struggling that's there. It used to be a notion that eating disorders were very uncommon. And technically, to meet criteria for like anorexia nervosa, according to the DSM-5, like, that's pretty strict. That's a pretty small percentage of the population, right? But to need help regaining confidence and the capacity to be present in our bodies and to feel empowered, and like our relationship with food is flowing organically and naturally, and it's not compulsive and it's not punitive and it's not based on messages of deprivation. I think most of us need some help with that. But to define, like, what is the difference between people who are struggling with what is expected in our society with disordered eating versus someone who has like full-blown eating disorder that's going to really require deep healing and real intervention, I don't know if you can make a general statement that would distinguish between those. But I think that's where clinical experience really helps, because after sitting with, hundreds or maybe more people who are struggling, you develop an intuitive sense to pick that up pretty quickly. And then if we're talking about for how do people in general understand if they don't have that level of experience working with people, I think it's us in each individual looking at their quality of life, right? I don't know if I can get more specific in a general way.
So if we drew a parallel, let's say, to sex addiction, which I do speak a lot
Yeah.
about. So everyone's got sex problems.
Yeah.
I think whatever that means, but everyone could be healthier in their relationship with sex. I think we can all agree with that, at least everyone I've ever spoken to. But meaning everyone I've ever spoken to about their relationship with sex. So I think it's everyone. However, when you talk about a sexual addiction, and I get there isn't like a line in the sand, there are certain things we're talking about. So I'll often say things like, if there's an addiction present, it'll be progressive in nature.
Right.
It's going to be getting worse over time. So it may be in the frequency of the use, in the intensity of the type of experiences one may needs to soothe their soul in the same way.
Yeah.
It may be in the variety of the type of experience that one thing is not doing it over and over. In other words, if someone is kind of watching the same pornography twice a month for 10 years, they may have an unhealthy relationship with sex that could be looked at and it could be improved,
right,
but they're not in the realm of addiction.
So I think the trajectory is a really good way of thinking about it. Like, if you have one data point, it doesn't tell you very much.
Correct.
But if you have a few, it tells you a lot more. So what direction is this person headed in tells you a lot. Let's take an extreme example. My mentor, one of my mentors, James Greenblatt, who's kind of like a guru in integrative psychiatry and eating disorders, who I previously worked with. What inspired him to work with eating disorders was he was on the inpatient psych unit, and he met a woman who had attempted suicide. And the reason she had tried to end her life was because she felt like binge eating had completely she had no life. Her entire life was one binge after another, and she had no power over it.
She was obsessed with food.
Yeah, and it's that's an extreme example, but to what degree has this taken over? So you might ask someone a question if they have insight, like, okay, here's your mind. Like, what percentage of your mind is occupied with concerned about food and worrying about food and how to stay away from food? And people who are really struggling will be like 98% of my mind or something like that. So you can gauge to some degree what the severity is by understanding better the person's experience.
So the examples you seem to be giving seem to be more related to the staying away from food, the
Binge.
anorexia.
The binge.
Not the binge, the staying away. You did say binge. Is that overeating?
Overeating. Well, probably a very common trajectory is people start out restricting, start out on some fundamental level feeling like there's a problem, like they cannot be at peace around food. So they find a solution, stay away from it, abstinence, right? They start to do that. It feels great. It feels empowering. You feel in control. It also is addictive because you get an endorphin rush from fasting, right? Fasting has been used forever to achieve a state that feels different, like an altered state of consciousness in some way. So you feel amazing, right? You repeat, right? You do that for a while, and eventually the human body is wired to survive, right? You have redundant hormonal systems designed to keep you driven to eat, right? Eventually that will take over. But what will happen is, because you've experienced a state of starvation, your primitive system doesn't know that the starvation was self-imposed. It just knows we've been through starvation. So, when someone has been through starvation and they see food, they don't have the regular inhibitory mechanisms. Like, they just have to get in as much as they can, as fast as they can. So that's pretty much a binge. So the binge episodes that are so severe that they're outside the range of our regular human experience are usually powered by a history of restricting, whether the person realizes that or not.
Understood. And when you talk about, say, overeating, right? Someone who's, tens or hundreds of pounds overweight.
Yeah.
Is that also disordered eating? Is that very different than the relationship someone may have with fasting and starvation?
It's tough because there's a very pretty intense movement to accept, health at every size, people at every body size and type, and people can feel very hurt if people assume that being overweight is a pathology. Like, what if this is really who I am? And I accept that on some level, as long as that is really who you are, as long as your body actually is operating in a healthy way at that place. I think, to me, health at every size means everyone has a right to inhabit their body in the healthiest, most optimal way that their body wants to be, right? But your question was if overeating.
Yes.
I lost
When you're
track of
talking
your
about
question.
eating disorders,
Yeah.
right? All the examples you seem to be giving seem to be related to the anorexic side of it.
Right.
Right. The starvation, the fasting, the binge that follows
Yeah.
that period. And I'm wondering, without getting into the politically correct stuff and offending sensibilities, just what it is.
Most people that I've met with really severe eating disorders have some element of restricting. I would say that the obsessionality is a kind of a core feature of a severe eating disorder, and it plays in at some point. People who only overeat can also really be struggling, but it's less common for it to get to such an extreme. But the truth is that in my clinical experience, the people who are brought into treatment are usually people who have struggled with not eating at some point, because not eating gets you into trouble medically and psychiatrically very quickly, right? Like, the body does not like to be in starvation mode. So if you starve yourself successfully, you're going to end up in treatment pretty quickly. Whereas if you're only overeating, even if it's really destroying your life and you feel totally out of control, you're not wrecking havoc with your physiology as quickly. So you're less like it's a longer road to end up in treatment. But the bottom line is, it doesn't matter. It's like, how much has a person's quality of life been disrupted? And that can be really horrible. Like, when you wake up in the morning and you don't feel like you have any power or conscious choice over how your day goes, and you're driven from compulsion to compulsion, and you don't have a chance to even enjoy food because food is so overwhelmingly addictive. Even if you never restricted in your life, like, that's a horrible place to be in. And it requires, like, it needs to be taken seriously, and those people deserve to heal. I think that's the hardest part of the eating disorder, actually, for people who restrict or don't restrict, is when you are at like a 12-step point, when you're like, I no longer have power over this behavior. It has totally taken over my psyche.
Have you found that 12 steps is helpful for eating disorders?
Um, I personally find that the approach is so integrated into our way of life that many of us use it without necessarily being in a 12-step group. Like, I think the capacity to acknowledge and be humbled and come to a point of realizing, like, I cannot get out of here myself, I need help. Like, that is a pivotal point in people's recovery.
Right, but that's just step one. There's
Yeah.
another 11. Right.
I haven't really gone hardcore in using the 12 steps for food. I think there are some merits to using the addiction model for eating disorders, but it's actually so very different in so many ways.
Understood. You
Yeah.
you said something earlier. I just want to make sure I understood it. You said your own recovery process. So
Yeah.
this is eating disorders is not just professional for you, it's personal.
Right. It's a personal matter for me. I have talked openly about this only actually very recently. I kind of waited a long time because I used to actually like to be able to bring it up like in a one-on-one session with someone, or even not even say it verbally, just be able to be like, hey, you realize I get this in the right moment. I felt like once I go out on air and I start to, I lost the capacity to like surprise
someone.
people one by one. But I think it's important. I think it's important to be honest about what brought me to this point, and to be able to share in a way that is empowering to others. Yeah. And I wouldn't be able to talk honestly about it if I wasn't real about how much of what I've learned is from my own experience. I mean, that's the real way we learn, through our
Right.
life experience. Yeah. And there was definitely a point in my life when I thought that I would not find liberation, right? Like, it was all consuming. And that, coupled with the fact that I was working with people in the psychiatric profession and I felt really trapped, I felt like I did not have the tools to help them. Those two things, like needing to find my own liberation and needing to be empowered to actually have tools to help people, were really what set me on my own journey.
Your own problems weren't enough to get you to, to
Well,
focus on
I
what you
don't know.
needed.
I think there's hashgacha pratis. I mean, there is hashgacha pratis too. It was like divine providence. Like, I mean, probably most people have this experience. It's like if you stay on your own path to healing and recovery, it's like people end up coming along for the ride, right? Because it's like if someone has already traveled through difficult but important terrain and they figure out how to navigate it, other people are going to want to come too, right? That's how we heal together.
Right. At the risk of offending anyone, I think that healers often invert like who's there for who.
Right.
Because if you think, I mean, you've used hashgacha pratis, divine providence. So if I think spiritually, right, suppose God needed a human being to,
Mediate.
right, to help this person, right? Like this person, sometimes and we need that, right? We need
Mhm.
a person to say something, and God still can't speak directly in a way that we'll hear. So he needs like a person to go and
Right.
do this thing. I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but that's the way the world is working. He can really, he
Right.
can change gravity and we can all start flying. But as long as gravity is working, we're also spoken to by another person, right? At least to know that we've for sure been spoken to. I know.
Like, rather than a boss call,
Exactly.
like a voice from heaven.
Exactly.
Right. We get the voices from heaven through people.
Right. So
Yeah.
presumably there's this person who needs help, right? This
Right.
patient out there. So a healer could be the one to do it, but so could 1,000 others. There's only one person that God doesn't have that influence over. And that's right. So like he needs, because of free choice, like he needs me to focus on me. He needs
Right.
you to focus on you. So my thought process has been like all these people bouncing into my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really been about me helping them. It's
They're
about
teaching you.
right, them helping me.
I feel that way all the time. Meaning, I sometimes I'm with a person I'm helping, and I literally feel like they are here to teach me. But at the same time, I understand why I'm the helper in that equation. Like, we are definitely helping each other, but there is something clear about what it means that I'm helping them in this situation, even though they're also for sure helping me at the same time.
Yeah, 100%. Well, but
Yeah.
there isn't one person for them.
Right.
But there is one person for you.
Right. Right.
Or in my case, one person for me.
Right.
Me.
Sometimes it's so eerie. Like I'll be working with clients and it'll literally feel like they were just placed there that day to remind me of something that I needed to work on in my process, in my own, like to keep in integrity, like that I really needed to work on.
Was it you who shared this diagram with me, like a Carl
The
Jung
wounded
diagram?
healer. I love that. Yeah.
It's like where it
Carl
flips.
Jung. Yeah, pretty much like on the surface, you have the wounded healer, helping the person who is wounded, healer helping the person who is wounded. But what brought the person into treatment was their own hope that they could heal. So essentially what brought them in is their own inner healer.
Right.
And their own inner healer beneath the surface is communicating with your wound. Because what brought the healer into the room to begin with?
The wound.
The wound. So
Right.
it's literally happening at the same time. Like on the surface, you have the healer talking to the wounded. And beneath the surface, the wounded is the healer talking to the wounded healer. It's
Right.
wild.
Right.
Right? I think Carl Jung probably spelled this out in even more beautiful terms, but like that's what's happening. And by the way, that's the difference between, I think on some level, a healer and a sham healer is like the healer who is conscious of what's going on beneath the surface, right? Conscious of what their wound is taking in and seeing the healer in the wounded person as they're helping them is the healer. Right? The person who thinks they're just the healer and the other person is simply the wounded and that's all that's going on is not the healer I would want to be sitting with.
Understood.
Yeah.
Understood. I get that. In terms of just to stay on eating disorders for a little more. So I think I have if I recapped it, the obsession around eating disorders where it's interrupting someone's life.
Yeah.
If someone's
It's like-
listening to this, like, hey, do I have disordered eating? Is this something that I should pay attention to? Because, it's very easy after someone's been, I don't know, kicked out of their house for infidelity to sit there and thinking, hey, I may
Right.
have a problem with sex addiction. It's very easy when someone gets checked into a hospital because their blood pressure is so low.
Right.
And they ask them when they had their last meal was
Mm-hmm.
that to identify that someone has an
Right.
eating disorder. But like you said, these things often start at a very, very, very young age. So
Right.
the question is if there's a way that we could intercept someone earlier in that process, before the hospital, before the
I
infidelity.
feel like this is one of your passion projects, right? Because you usually go here in your questions where you're like, okay, but how could we get people before they're in crisis? You brought that up with Danny. You were
Yes.
like, how can we be the people who come to do journey work because we want to grow, not because we can't live anymore and we need help, right? Like, how can we start to heal sooner? And also, you keep taking that question farther back and you're going to be like, well, how can we bring children into the world so that they are in harmony with their bodies and they see food as something that you take in to nourish yourself? Like, how do we, prevention, not even prevention, like more than, deeper than prevention, right? Like, how do we thrive as human beings? Why are we sitting here trying to figure out how to clean up the mess of someone's splattered psyche? Like, what happened before, right? Like,
Right.
how do we get in there earlier?
No, this is definitely a passion. I'll explain it.
Yeah.
So I think what it comes down to is like really poor standards that many of us have just around all aspects of our life.
Yeah.
And then we bring that to many others. And my question is like, how do we
Raise
raise
the bar.
How do we raise the standards? The amount of people who are comfortable in poverty, as an example, and that is just weird. It's sad. But that's financial poverty, emotional poverty. There's so many different examples of this
Yeah.
where what I see is someone who's often is like our standards are incredibly low. So when we're having conversations around healing specifically, some people are like, oh, if the issue is really extreme, why does it have to be really extreme? Can't I live
Yeah.
like a beautiful, joyful life, and anything less than that is really extreme?
I feel like this comes up in our community a lot, where the people who are striving to raise the bar are kind of sometimes seen as like, why do you have to be so critical? Can't we just move on? Right? Like the generations before. I mean, they went through, the Holocaust.
I don't want to go through another
and
Holocaust.
they were just living their lives. Like, what are you, sitting around in therapy, focusing on the problems, right? And I was just chatting with a neighbor the other day who was talking about this, and it was like, Yeah, but we have the capacity in our generation, like through divine providence and through whatever else is going on in the world, we have the capacity to raise the bar. By the way, I think a lot of people who end up in psychiatric treatment are people who see more possibility for themselves and for the world, and they're actually not willing on some fundamental level to settle. And everyone around them is like, why are you depressed? Like, life's not so bad. And they're like, they're trying to verbalize or articulate like I'm not okay because my standard is actually higher, right? Like I'm not a problem. I actually see possibilities and therefore I'm not comfortable in the status quo. So I just think that's a really important message for people to take in, that like when people are focusing on problems or feeling like they're stuck in a state of problems, it's not actually usually coming from a place of wanting to be negative. It's coming because they see more possibility fundamentally. Like they want more out of life. And they can be the people who can actually help us raise the bar if we start listening to them. Like I remember when I was thinking about, to go a little darker here, right? Like I spent quite a lot of time on the inside of American psychiatric hospital units, right? And like it hit me on a fundamental level at some point that these units are not about the people who are suicidal. They're about everyone around them not being okay with people who are not having the status quo. Like these people who are suicidal, they're like, I'm not living my life like this, right? Like fundamentally, I deserve a life worth living, and the life you're asking me to settle for is crap. And I'm not doing it. And the people around them are not cool with that. They're like, you need help. We're gonna shut you down, right? We're going to give you a little bit of sedation, right? Sedating chemicals. And then you're going to get really quiet. And then you're going to, right, be in an institution where you have no freedom, by the way. So, it's literally locked. And then by the time you're kind of, drooling and having other side effects, it really does seem like that person is fundamentally disabled and ill and that they're the problem. But that's not how the story began.
I see that.
Yeah.
I definitely see the parallel within the frum community, the Orthodox community, where like I get most people's frustration who leave. Like most of the kids who are leaving, I get it. And very often, like when I talk to them, I'm like, these are the guys we need to be listening to.
Right.
Like they have it right.
Exactly.
Right. Like this is not okay. This is
yeah.
It's like, oh, you just don't want to be frum. No, I'm saying that what I'm seeing is not as good as it could be.
Yeah.
Let's do something about it.
If we would welcome that and we'd be like, oh, what do you have to say? Like we could all raise the bar together, right? Like, and this comes back to the wounded healer healing wounded. Like the people who are wounded have the capacity to help us heal, right? Meaning the reason they're suffering is because they're tapped in to the pain, and the pain is a portal to possibility. Like if you don't get stuck on the pain and freaked out about it, you appreciate that pain is a signal of something that needs to be realigned. And the people who are feeling the pain are the people we need to start listening to, right? Not the people we need to pathologize, because when we pathologize them, we stop listening to them.
It sounds similar to the name of your book.
Call Me Borderline.
Call Me Borderline.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I read the back of it, I haven't read the book yet because it just came out. But when I read the back of it, it seemed like using the borderline way in a lot of positive.
Yes. So some people were like, actually my husband, Eli, decided to publish the book. Thank you very much, Eli. Eli put a lot of dedication and really helped me brainstorm that entire book. It was really a collaborative project. But a few people were like, maybe just change the title before you let him publish it. Because they're like, people are going to walk away with this idea. They're like, maybe you have borderline personality disorder. I'm like, fine. Like, if it's not self-evident that I am proud to put that on the cover of the book, that's the whole point of the book. It's like a reference to call me Ishmael, but also it's like, let's take that as a compliment. Call me borderline. I will own that term and whatever it means with pride, because essentially the borderline state, and I'm not talking necessarily strictly about someone who is like currently being diagnosed with whatever they clinically term borderline personality disorder. I'm talking about the borderline state of human existence where you are stripped raw, right? where you are feeling pain and you like can't contain it, right? And I believe that that is a place of immense possibility for human beings.
How did the name borderline come about?
So
Can you describe borderline personality disorder in a
yeah, so if you
nutshell, and
read
the
when
name?
you read the book, it is a very vulnerable read. So what happened was I was in my first course of therapy with someone who had a stellar reputation. Okay.
You were the patient.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this experience changed my life. Like it really left me committed to shifting the way I understood everything about what was going on in healing, because we had this really intense connection bond. She was the first person I ever knew really outside of the frum community. I was like 20 and just born kind of situation, just living out of the Crown Heights bubble for the first time in my life, and decided to go get some, help. And essentially, when I started to really trust her and really start to go deeper in my own work, she kind of freaked out. And essentially she said, maybe you should look at this diagnosis. Like maybe this is your problem, pretty much. And the diagnosis, borderline personality disorder, is intense feelings of emptiness, fears, chronic fears of abandonment. That's what's going on internally, and intense and unstable interpersonal relationships, bonds. That's what's going on internally. And behaviorally, it's known by intense emotion dysregulation, which, by the way, I actually did not meet criteria for borderline. But I think what happened was that our attachment got really close, and somehow her using that diagnosis was like a way of kind of pushing me away. And then she actually it ended in a pretty extreme way, and she was never willing to speak with me again. Like I never got to say like goodbye, or the way, I never got to say, I did not get the last word, right? So here I am trying to get the last word. No, it left me on a quest, right? Of like, wow, she was really experienced, and she was a pretty impressive therapist, and I was a pretty good patient. Like I showed up, I did what she told me to do. Like, and this was my first experience. So I had that innocence, right? That I was like, wow, this has something to teach me. Like, I don't even know what I have to learn from this, but it motivated me to write Call Me Borderline, which was about the danger of what happens when you pathologize, right? Like her, in a way, calling me borderline destroyed our relationship. And our relationship was what was healing. Like, and I want to say that if there's one thing people take out of this, like healing in relationships, healing happens in relationships. Like sometimes relationships or our attachment system, like where we feel okay, where we feel held, where we feel connected, is so taken for granted that it's like the water we're swimming in and the air we're breathing. Like my mental health doesn't depend on attachment, because you don't realize that you have an attachment system. But people who don't have an intact attachment system, like maybe they feel completely misunderstood by their family of origin, and they haven't found relationships that are loving and meaningful, like they're lost as human beings. We don't function alone. Like we're not wired like that. So essentially, borderline personality disorder in some ways happens when a person has not yet found an attachment network that works for them. And once you understand it that way, it's very simple. It's like, of course they're acting out, of course they seem out of control because they're actually not okay. Like their relational needs are actually not being met. Like they're not manipulating you for the help, just to drive you crazy. They're asking you to help because they actually need something.
So the virtue you see here is what?
That they are open to connection. Like they're not shut down. They're not closed off and becoming like if a person is starved of connection, right? They can shut down and then just feed off of other people, or adopt a persona and become all ego, right? But they're choosing not to do that, or they're not able to do that. They're staying raw, they're staying open, and they're saying, please, like, I want connection. Now they are conflicted about it because they're afraid of connection because they've been hurt by it before, but they're staying open. That's the possibility. That's why I have so much respect for people like that.
Oh, understood. And maybe this is the link you're making with kind of all um, those who are psychotic, right? There's a certain possibility in that I'm railing against a system in some way. There's something that's not working versus becoming numb and accepting of it and saying
calloused.
Okay.
Or like fully ego or fully persona, or like I'll just feed off of other vulnerable people. No, they're like, I'm suffering. I want to grow. Like, help me. Yeah. And in some ways, there was a time when people thought of eating disorders as a behavioral manifestation of a borderline state of being. And in some ways, I see that as having truth, right? Because if you can't comfortably take in nourishment, it's like you can't be okay with having needs because having needs has hurt you so badly. And having physical, like, it says, we're not hungry or thirsty for food and drink, right? Like, what are we actually hungry and thirsty for? Like real connection, spirituality, maybe where some people find real connection, but it's not actually about the food, right? It's about a fundamental, like,
a spiritual thirst, a spiritual
thirst, hunger. Maybe the person has no longer even knows when there's love around them how to receive it, right? Like, in some ways, healing relationally is the simplest thing. It's like, okay, we're here, we have time, and I'm here to be loving to you. Where it becomes more complex is the person, for whatever reason, is no longer receiving the love I have for them. Maybe they're like, you don't actually mean it. You're just a therapist. You don't really care about me. Who needs you anyway, right? Like, they've walled off, right? Like, love is actually available to all of us, right? Like, we can wake up in the morning and be like, I'm here because the universe apparently cares about me and loves me and thinks it's important for me to be here. And we can feel that, but not everyone wakes up feeling that. So what's actually missing is not the love. What's actually missing is the capacity to receive it. So that's the art of relational healing. Like, you could give love, but it's not meaningful unless you've helped the person open up to receive it.
Understood. Right. And if someone's been hurt, I've often said this, that we're hurt through people, right? Most people's traumas, when you get down to it, it's not in a vacuum, right? There's someone, a mother, a father, an uncle, a cousin, a neighbor. There's someone who hurt them. And then the healing is through people as well. So that's what you mean when you use the term relational
healing. Yeah, because it fades out into the background when it's not a problem, right? And even when it is a problem, people call it something else, like depression, anxiety, borderline. But fundamentally, what is actually going on? Like, if you are loved, think about it. If you are loved and accepted and you belong and you're cherished and you're wanted somewhere, you could wake up like in a rough spot, or in a place where you're not comfortable, and you can have a sense like, I'm going to make it through. But if you wake up like, in a mansion, but you feel like nobody actually cares if you're around, like, you feel depressed. So I just think it's so simple that we overlook it, right? Like, and we get caught up in like these complexities of like, maybe there's a neurochemical imbalance, like maybe, or maybe it's genetic, maybe. But like, on a fundamental level, if they felt accepted and loved and cherished, would they feel an iota better than they feel now? Probably. So why don't we start there?
So, and oftentimes when you're working with someone with an eating disorder, are you getting involved in their family of origin? Meaning, are the others? I'm talking about the successful ones, right? When you're seeing it work, are you seeing that the family takes some level of responsibility? Hey, like, if this is a relational problem that's going on here, right? Is what you're saying, and someone is has developed a dependency or an obsession with food because of problems in their relationships. That means presumably they themselves, that individual, was not getting what they need in their immediate relation.
There's
and
like
the healing would come
in there's a split, right? Like, there's family-based treatment, which says, especially with adolescents, like, it's all about the family. Let's work with the family. And then there are people who are like, no, the problem was the family. So let's remove child from the family and give them love outside the family.
Well, they're
So-
not disagreeing, though.
Yeah, they're agreeing, right? But they're disagreeing about how to implement now. So, and I think there can be different valid approaches depending on the situation. Sometimes it's like the family of origin is so far gone that like you're going to have to take this person and help them build an attachment system from scratch. But if you can work with the family of origin, like that's where the deepest healing happens. I have a
But if these are the two views,
Yeah.
right, then both the views arrive at the
same
problem.
premise.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't know how anyone, I mean, I think that's a fundamental truth. Yeah, I think these conditions grow, like they take root in the context of relationships. And like the healing happens, if it can happen in the original relationships, that's a beautiful thing. And if not, it's going to take a lot of work to cultivate relationships that, and they're, by the way, the relationships you cultivate later, they never quite substitute for the relational healing you didn't get earlier, right? Like to some degree, there's still going to be a void, and you figure out how to channel that void. That void to me is back to the borderline state. It's like what's left open as pain, and you figure out how to use that pain as a drive to continue to grow. Like you stop to see the pain as a pathology and you start to see it as a realm of possibility. But I have a supervisor who I'm still in touch with. She was treating a young woman from family. She had all 14 siblings come to every single session.
Oh, wow.
And her rule, she's a psychiatrist, by the way. She's retired now. But she will not see someone to treat them as their psychiatrist if all family members don't show up to the first meeting. So people will complain. They'll be like, I have work. She'll be like, find another psychiatrist. Like, I'm not taking on your child as a problem. Like, you think there's a problem in your family, you better all show up.
Right. The idea is there, and I understand the idea.
Yeah.
I saw a line the other day. It said, we would never see a plant that's, leaves were eroding, and we'd say
Right.
it has leaf development disorder.
Right.
And we pay attention to the water, the soil, the weather, the climate,
Exactly.
everything else around it, and say, hey, why isn't this
Yeah.
flourishing? And we should do the same thing with.
Or like Stephen
With human
Radowitz's analogy, like we would never send someone with a broken leg home with treatment for a pain disorder and give them painkillers, right?
Right.
That would seem ludicrous, but that's essentially how we treat depression, anxiety, mood disorders. We're like, you have a mood problem. Here's something to stabilize your mood. But what is actually out of alignment? We have no idea, right?
Right. This has definitely been a major passion of mine, because the same way you're saying pathologizing, I think you're saying the same thing. Like, oh, you're going to call that person the issue. They have the pathology and everyone else around them
Right.
is okay. No, if we're seeing this, like what percentage of people do we need to see obese, addicted,
Right.
in order to say like, hey, we got a much.
Yeah, like
much-
95% of
Yes.
the people are problematic just so that some people can have the illusion that they're okay. You understand, like we created a DSM to be like, we all understand what's happening here. We're all okay except everybody, right? Here's what's wrong with everybody. And it's like the illusion, it's obvious, it's hilarious. It's like it's an obvious illusion. Like, why don't we put the book aside and look at ourselves? Like, where are we not okay and how do we do better, right? So in many ways, pathologizing, psychologizing, they can have value, right? Like truly understanding the human mind and human physiology can have value, but it can become a way of othering and creating an illusion of pseudo understanding that keeps us actually from growing, right? And actually from understanding, right? The beginning of understanding is saying we don't know.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah, I think with addiction, that's been my journey, and I use the term. I have an episode on an earlier podcast called "Am I an Addict?" because this was a struggle of mine for a long time. Am I addicted to pornography, or is it just what?
Right.
It wasn't working. None of this was working. What did I need to know? Whether it fits someone else's definition or word. The whole premise made no sense, but it consumed me for over a
Right.
year of whether or not I am or am not an
Wow.
addict.
Yeah. I went back to this residential campus this week to cover, right? And I sit down with like this 14-year-old girl and she's like, I need to know if I meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Like that's where they're at. Because think about it. This poor girl is 14. she's like trying so hard to find an identity for herself. And where does she find herself? In a residential mental health institution. So the identity she's going to look for is a mental health disorder, because those are the identities available to her. It's like the identity is available. Do I have post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yeah. She wanted to meet it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So she was like, please tell me I meet criteria, because she needed an identity to hold on to. But like from the outside, you look at her and you're like, you're literally in a mental health institution. So you don't realize that your range of choices is such a like, why would you want to choose from the DSM if you can choose from like really cool, amazing, empowering identities that are out there in the world? But she doesn't see this because she's literally physically, socially in a mental health institution. So that's a long road for people, because it would not be helpful if I were like to her, hey, I don't think we need diagnoses, because she needs a diagnosis right now. You know, like, so in some ways, meeting her where she's at and using the diagnosis as a tool to show her that I'm willing to understand her more deeply, and helping her see that the diagnosis is maybe a beginning of understanding what she may be going through. But it would be, and I tell this to adolescents especially, like, it would be embarrassing for you to settle for a description that someone else who doesn't even know you came up with. Like, don't you see yourself as more than that? Right? Like, yeah, we can use it to help understand some of your symptoms, but it's not who you are. And it's like, if we're going to use the diagnoses as maybe some sort of map, right? But we would never...
Like a healing map, like a direction for
but we would never think, because we looked at a map, that we visited the territory. It's like silly, right? So everyone knows that. Like, when they originally wrote the DSM, it was supposed to help guide clinical research, not how people actually like their name identity. Themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is an issue that exists in the 12 steps, but I actually understand both sides of it, right? That idea of walking in and saying, I am an addict. It's so necessary in order to embark on the healing process. Like, I am an addict. Like, I'm done.
Acknowledge.
I give up. This is where I'm at. Like, why? Just for that humility and openness to go somewhere. But the way I envision it is as a ladder.
Yeah.
And in order to climb up the ladder, the rung that we use to pull us up, we're going to have to let go of if we want to get higher up the ladder.
Right.
And that rung in my life looked at some point of time as I am an addict, and repeating that over and over.
Right.
And then eventually that came the rung that I was holding on that helped me from going
to grow,
to grow further on. So, and the reason I say both of those is because many people are reeling out of control will say, oh, I don't want to go to a meeting and say I am an addict.
Right.
Okay, go say
Exactly.
I'm an addict. That's your liberation. Eventually, your liberation of today is your prison of tomorrow. Eventually, that will imprison you, but, easy does it. Right. Don't try to skip 17 rungs on the ladder. This is what you need today, is to embrace this path of healing that so many have found liberation from. Unfortunately, yes, do I see people who have found liberation through recovery from addiction and today are in the prison of recovery from addiction? I do.
Right.
I do, but I'd rather that prison than the prison of just addiction.
Right.
Just,
so we're sitting here now and we're talking about, from our vantage point, the possibilities are so vast and cannot be squared into a diagnosis. But like, is there a time and place for everything? Is this girl pretty much saying, I need you to look me in the face and say that you see that I'm suffering and this is the only way I'll understand you? Maybe.
Sure.
And some diagnoses are more harmful than others. Like, I have a fundamental problem with the diagnosis that the book is called Call Me Borderline, because saying it's a personality disorder, it's like suggesting that there's something fixed and problematic about who they are. And that is just untrue and misleading. It's not clarifying, right? Like, if somebody's going to say, needs to acknowledge, like, I have an issue, then using language that helps them understand the problem, right? Not using language that obscures the problem so much that they just feel like they themselves are the problem and now they don't know where to go from here.
Right.
Right? Like in your example, it's like, I'm an addict, brings me to this 12 step and an approach to healing. But what if someone's stuck saying, I have a personality disorder and everything on Google says personality disorders are incurable?
Well,
and that's right.
No, but some people view addiction in the same way. They say things like once an addict, always an addict. But within recovery meetings, you'll hear people some people choose to refine the language. So some will say, I am recovering from an addiction. Or some people will say, a lot of people say, hey, I'm this, I'm an addict, right? That's the standard
Right.
terminology. And then every once in a while, you'll hear someone say, I'm recovering or I've recovered. And they're embracing a language, which I think it's probably only English that works like this, where we say I am when we mean, when we really mean I have.
I have.
Like it doesn't, I don't think it exists.
Like I have depression instead of saying I am depressed. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like that.
So we can do better, you know? Be like, I have a problem. Or you just keep it really simple. Like, I acknowledge I have a problem and I need to heal, right? Then once you start calling it names that other people have come up with, it does get sticky. And look, it gets to be semantics at a certain point, but then in real time, it really matters, especially when you're dealing with young individuals and using terms that really are not capturing the essence of the problem. Like in no world does borderline personality disorder help you understand what the person is actually going through.
Right.
Right.
But the positive spin you put on it was beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you find that as necessary for your own healing and for others? Because for me, I read a bunch of definitions on addiction, and I come across this one addiction that's like, okay, this is my new one. I ran with it. It came from Chase Taub. It said, an addict, the average person is someone for whom spirituality is a luxury. An addict is someone for whom spirituality is a necessity.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, that's so empowering. I can get
Right.
behind that. I wonder if more people who found...
It reminds me of this, like, 4 people will walk by a dead bird, 4 children. 3 of the children will just like, la la la, and 1 will start to think about the bird's family and like what happened to the bird, and like that one is at risk, you know, for struggling with addiction. So
Right.
to me, they're all big compliments, these diagnoses. Like I like people who are suffering because I think they're cool and I think they're deep and I think they're aware and tapped into what's really going on here. The famous, like, it is no measure of wellness to be well adjusted to a sick society.
Thank you.
Like, I don't relate to people who are like, okay with where we're at. I'm like, I don't get it.
But do you
right?
consider yourself struggling today?
I would.
I mean, is that the destination? What are we selling?
Yeah, I would say that it's a struggle. I would say that I'm really happy to be here in this world. I feel full of hope. And I feel honored and privileged to be doing the work that I do and living the life that I live. Like, I feel so grateful, but it is hard. It is really hard. And it's like anyone who's been hanging around me knows that my Da'ani has been like a big refrain for me, because I read a passage from a young woman who unfortunately did not make it. And the passage was something like, I just couldn't get myself to say it because I didn't feel like when I woke up, I didn't feel like thanking anyone. I felt like, why did you do this to me? Right? Like, this is too hard. And that I was working with that for a while. I was like, okay, what is this? And I came to a place where my Da'ani started to mean something very different to me. It just started to mean like literally, like my Da'ani, humbled am I. First of all, you don't start with I, right? Like the first word is in Hebrew. It's like, humbled am I before you. It's like, that's how I feel about life. I feel like humbled before you. I feel like it's a lot to carry. Like, really, it's a lot. But I'm humbled. Like, it's
As opposed
also,
to gratitude, which is the way people typically translate it.
Yeah.
You choose humbled.
Humbled. Because gratitude is like, to me, it's like, I don't feel it as much. It's like humbled is like, I feel what that means. It's like a humility. It's like a state of being. It's like a way I carry myself, right? It's like something I can lean into. It's just how I feel about life right now, right?
Gotcha. You know what I recently noticed about that prayer, which for some reason I never noticed before, is the way it ends. So people thought, oh, Modani, and they'll talk about the prayer and they'll say how it's usually the term gratitude, use the term humbled, but grateful for giving me another chance.
Mm-hmm.
But then it ends, right? Rabba emunasecha.
Right.
Great is your belief. Whose belief?
Right.
Right? Is someone's belief, God's belief, the universe's belief in me.
Right.
Like that's huge.
Right.
That's huge. That I'm given another breath because someone truly believes in me.
Right.
If that's an internalization that can jumpstart.
Wow.
A
I mean,
day.
it's so powerful because it's like, if we were in a utopia, like, it wouldn't take great faith to believe in us to get up and like go swimming and like hang out in the sun. Like, no, we've been given a lot of work to do. So someone better be better be
Right.
trusting us to do it. I really connect with that prayer. And when I went to South America, actually, and I sat with some women from Ecuador in the morning, they were singing their songs all night. In the morning, they asked me to share something. So I sang like the most childish version of Modani, like that's just what came out. And their words were like, this gives us hope for humanity. They don't
Really?
even speak
They didn't know what it
Hebrew.
meant, right?
Yeah. They were just like, we have hope for humanity. Yeah.
I hear, I hear that. So, can you describe what the problem is? What's the when you say there's a lot of work to do? What is it that you're trying to do? I'm not talking globally, but what is
Yeah,
it?
to ease pain and suffering. There's a lot of pain. And it's like yesterday I was in the airport, right? It's like I forgot to bring my 4-year-old stroller. It's like, okay, I'm happy she's healthy and alive, but like it would be really nice if when she were sleeping, I had a stroller to put her into. Like it would be really nice. So it's like we can't resolve and solve the pain in the universe. It's not our responsibility. But like when there's someone who can like put their hands out and like help you out when it's too much, like it really helps. It really makes a difference. So just to be able to do that for ourselves and for other people, and in that subtlety of not being alone with the pain, I see that as being the point of transformation, where the pain goes from being overpowering and the person can't move, like they can't contribute, to the pain being this powerful drive where the person is like energized to go share their light with the world.
Is that going from a me problem to a we problem? Is that
In some ways,
in
yeah.
some ways?
Yeah. It's almost like I stopped questioning, like when people say it's too much for them, I'm like, it really is. You know, like I'm not pushing them to acceptance if they're not actually holding there, because it's like when you have physical pain and agony, right? Like, and it gets to a point where you literally can't move. It's like, you just got to get through it, right? And then something comes along and like you start moving and you start to, and all of a sudden it's like energy in a way, right? It's not finite, right? Like, you know, that feeling when you're feeling really tired and then an emergency siren goes off,
Right.
right? Or like someone had a baby, I don't know. And all
Right.
of a sudden you're like ready to
Energized.
roll,
Right.
right? So I see that as like the pivotal difference. Like the enough support comes together that the person's like, oh, I'm here. Like, I actually want to live. I actually want to do this. It's like, to me, this work is not about pushing people who don't want to live. Like, what kind of work is that? The work is actually figuring out what it's going to take, that they on their own are like, yeah, I want this life. This is good.
Right. And I want to tell others about it also.
Yeah.
So what are some of the important
Taste and see that godliness is good.
right, something I
can't-
often say.
You can't taste or see for somebody else, but if you can be part of putting the conditions in place that this human being can be like, oh yeah, life is good. Like, that's the most beautiful, precious thing there is.
Amen to that. What are some of the important, I don't know, modalities of healing that you've worked with yourself or you've seen
Yeah,
help?
that's a hard one because, you know, I went into training, not the therapy route, right? Like, I went to a nursing program, right? The reason I did that was because I like accelerated, like I like movement. I like when things work. So at the time I was young and naive. I was like, medicines for the mind. Like, this makes sense. I got to figure out what those are, right? And then I quickly got very disappointed by what I saw, you know, because I was interested in working with these psychic wounds that we're talking about, like these relational wounds, these emotional wounds, and psychiatric medications are just not that powerful.
So that's the route you went.
Yeah.
At first. That's
So-
what psychiatric nurse practitioner
Yeah.
means.
I mean, like, I could have gone to medical school to do that, but I didn't want to give up that much time with my family. So this was another route that I could prescribe
Got it.
and learn how to work with medicines. So that took me on a route of really coming to terms with these were not medicines I wanted to use for people. And this is what I had sunk $250,000 plus and, you know, 12-hour shifts and a lot of energy and resources
So
into.
you're talking like antidepressants and
Yeah.
anxiety pills, like
Yeah. And I was like, this is what I can do now. and I don't actually want to do it. And then I would do it anyway. And my conscience would be like, and people around me would just say like, keep doing it. You'll see it actually does help some people. And of course, the way the universe works, the people would find me were not the people who are benefiting from them. And, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, like I had colleagues who were seeing good results. I don't know if great results, but they felt like they were good results. I was just really not seeing that. Maybe count on a hand the times that I saw that. And even then it was not
So
lasting.
someone coming to you with depression and you're prescribing SSRIs or other antidepressants, and it's not.
Yeah, that was
moving the
actually
needle.
one of the reasons I worked in eating disorders, because it's fairly accepted that medications are not that helpful. So I was never pushed to prescribe more than the basics with eating disorders.
When you say pushed by who?
Insurance companies, supervisors, clients, their families. I mean, I remember working with adolescents, and I would have to rationalize and get on the phone with the insurance companies explaining why I was not putting a traumatized child on an antipsychotic. Like, they wanted me to start an antipsychotic for this traumatized child. And I was like, why would I do that? And you're an insurance company and I'm supposed to be the practitioner. And
Meaning, so you're billing them for
they're paying for the person's treatment.
Like, hey, why?
Yeah.
And how come I haven't seen a charge yet for?
Yeah, they're reading the notes.
Right.
Like, why is there no Zyprexa? And I'm like, because they're not psychotic and it's an antipsychotic. And this is how the conversations would go. And
Wow.
and it was like, I would come into the room some days. Like, I remember this one day I came into the room and you had like 8 wonderfully smart, sensitive adolescent people who were like lost, trying to find themselves. And like 3/4 of them were literally asleep because they're like on sedating medications and they're supposed to be here getting their deluxe treatment that insurance is paying for. It got so depressing that I just couldn't take it anymore. But your question was, so I've continued and finding medicines for the mind, and that's how we came to the conversation, I think, of medicines that come from the earth, medicines that are not found in a pill bottle, medicines that maybe our establishment has a hard time giving us liberty to utilize in a healing way. But I think it's confusing for people because they have reason in our culture to trust the pill bottle that their trusted practitioner gave to them. But to be honest with people, like, I also came to a point where I realized that even though I was prescribing them, I had no way to verify what was actually in the pill. Like, I was prescribing, let's say lithium, but I don't know what else is in the formulation. Like, where is this pill actually coming from? And people can be very sensitive and start having side effects to the fillers.
And they could be different?
And they can be different depending on the generic.
Meaning you won't even know?
I won't even know, right.
By the time they go to the pharmacy, that decision is made.
Yeah, it's basically
Somewhere
based on what their
chain.
Insurance will cover. I'm like, at a certain point, I'm like, how can I have any intuitive sense about a medication for a human being? I don't even know what's in it. And honestly, I've never felt good on these medications myself. And but that is really, I want to be careful about that, because I know there are people out there who may be benefiting from medications. And I understand that there are many paths to healing, right?
If they're doing so well, they're probably not listening to this.
And, but it came to a point where it was like, if I don't ever want to put it in my own body again, good luck to me giving it to another human being that I care about and love with a clear conscience.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And that took you, so your journey kind of is coinciding, I guess. Your own personal and professional are kind of coinciding.
Yeah.
As we speak and over time.
Yeah. You know what the litmus test for me though is?
Go ahead.
Are the people I'm working with getting better? Because it's very subtle, but also very obvious. Back to the wounded healer. Like, is the healer a step ahead of their wounds so that they can actually guide the person whose wound is active? Because if the healer is actually acting as a healer but consumed by their wounds, we know this is not going to go very well. And their wounds are going to end up splattering on the person who's already wounded, right? So how do you actually keep yourself in check if the people you're working with are actually healing? Right? If they're actually getting better. So anyway, we're saying they were coinciding. And I started to look for what is out there that is a medicine for the mind, a medicine for trauma that works. And I found out about it the real hardcore nerdy way, like scholar, Google, like looking through the data studies. And then I came across some of the original studies on psilocybin. I had no idea what it was. It's like, what is this? The effect size is like 0.8 or something, which is unheard of in psychiatry, the effect size for depression.
What does that
It's
mean?
like 1 is the max effect size. And for psilocybin in this trial, it was 0.8. Antidepressants are like around 0.3. So that's huge.
And 80% of people.
I don't actually.
Is that what it means?
I'm not a statistician.
Got it. Okay.
But it's good.
It's good.
It's good. And I had a statistician over at my house, Yale grad for Shabbos. I was like, talk to me about this effect size. Is this real? Or is like, I don't even know what psilocybin is. Yeah. And he's like, and he's a very cerebral guy, like very straight. It's like, oh, the data is very clear.
So,
like you cannot compare these results to antidepressants. I was like, oh, so why are we not using them? He's like, good question.
so just to be clear, you came about this through research that psilocybin, meaning there's actual research, people who've studied this, that it is much more effective.
Yeah.
But one, you're getting an insurance company to push you to do, and the other, the law is saying you can't do.
Yeah, because the psychiatric system is not a healing system, it's a mental illness system. And it operates on things that help manage symptoms, arguably, to a point, but people don't actually start to thrive. They stay in the system, if they choose to. They don't actually get on their own 2 feet and go on their way, right?
So what did you do after that?
That began my explorations of what psilocybin actually is. And I personally didn't really see any other way to understand without experience. I actually, back in the day, psychiatrists actually, now this idea seems far out, they used to actually take psychiatric drugs and try them out for themselves, right? So back to what we said before, we learn through our own life experience.
I have a friend who's a medicine man in Costa Rica, and he says every single blend he gets before he serves it to anyone else, he'll always take a little bit himself.
There you go.
Right,
so it's like I started to explore. I started to grow. Really beautiful things started to happen in my life. And I still see that as a primary modality for helping people deal with the level of wounding that we're looking at in our time. I'm sure that there are other ways, and I'm not under some delusion that this is the only way. I think we're going to keep coming back to it.
But why does it need to be? If we find something that's working, no one ever asks that question in anything else. If I'm looking for a pair of pants, do these pair of pants fit? Is it the only way to... No, it doesn't have to be the only way. I think that...
Because human nature has a way of getting very excited about something that works. And then there can be like a hype of like, this is the cure-all. And you don't want to fall into that trap.
No, for sure not. That's not the idea. But I was coming from the other side that what I often hear is like how many explanations and justifications need to be given for something that works. It just
like, why am I the one who has to keep explaining myself? I find that to be true.
Like if it works, it works.
Yeah.
Like that's all. It's not.
And I find myself explaining the most basic ideas and having to really, and I'm like, wait, why is the burden of proof on me? Or let them go explain themselves. Let them go explain how what is actually happening in these psychiatric institutions is happening with right? Like in this world, we may feel a need to explain ourselves. But when you are taking a child, we don't know what's going on with them, and they're on 4 or 5 medications with intense side effects, right? I have to explain myself to the insurance company that I'm opting out, right?
Right, exactly.
So who is the burden of proof on here, right?
Right, so here you're coming, and I've had a number of conversations on this podcast about psychedelics, but I think this is the first one outside of the conversation we did on ketamine, where it's someone coming from a psychiatric background, right, and looking at it based, research-based, and then from there saying, hey, how can this help me? Like my own journey was, I just wanted to be better, right?
Right.
That's all. And I was working on my addiction and working on the other stuff connected to that, anxiety and depression, and and everything connects, whether it
Right.
was challenges at work or my personal life. And eventually coming across an interview with Gabor Mate and Tim Ferriss. And obviously I'd heard different stuff about it,
Right.
but Gabor was someone that I was following closely and had developed a lot of respect for his approach. And he says he has not seen anything heal addicts like ayahuasca has.
Right.
Like it's been
Right.
what he's the number one treatment for addiction that he's come across.
Right.
And this is a guy steeped in the conversation
Right.
who I respected and wrote books about it. And he tells me he just came across about it. He just
Yeah.
came across it and became aware of it in the last several years.
And
how through his own
healing.
work with it himself, and then working with it with others. So of course I was intrigued, and I said, yeah, let me go down that road. I've tried everything else, and it's not like things weren't working. Things were. I was in a
Right.
better place the first time I drank ayahuasca than I was 5 or 6 years before, but there was still a lot that was missing. And when I had a resounding stamp from this guy who I respected, I went forward with it. Obviously that's not the same as where do I get it? Who do I get it from?
Right.
Like all of those things have to be figured out as well. There aren't those regulatory bodies today that exist, and you're going somewhere into South America with some,
yeah,
we're
we're not
right.
giving anyone the impression that this is like it can be complex.
100%.
But to hear, like you're saying, that like I did whatever I could to master what was accepted here as the culmination of our expertise and experience as a system. Like I put in the effort and the capacity to understand that, to train in that, to appreciate it, and it still brought me to this point.
So I do want to have a conversation around the concerns and the limitations of it, but before that I want to talk about the the benefits of it. So when you say psychiatric drugs was at 0.3 and psilocybin was at 0.8, well,
for depression,
right? You, like you said, you're not a statistician, and we're not going to go into exactly what that means, but suffice it to say, it's better. Significantly better. So what is it in your experience that's enabling someone to find healing through this?
Yeah.
What's going on?
Yeah.
Chemically, emotionally.
They're finding their truth.
So,
it's a very non-clinical explanation, but it's like clinical explanations sometimes are very long-winded. It's like they're finding their truth. How to explain exactly how that happens through healing agents, healing medicines.
I don't need chemically, just what are you seeing? Meaning someone who you're sitting there talking to someone, right? You gave a very clear example earlier where hey, you're sitting with someone who has love for you, who cares about you, but that person is not able to receive it.
Yeah.
Because of a number of reasons, they're not able to receive it. And that ability, just that one ability of being able to absorb the love that is already around them will make their life better. Maybe 1 degree, maybe 180 degrees, but it's going to make it better. So if I can affect that, then likely.
So what needs to happen is people need to open to receive. That's what these medicines help people do. It's like psychiatric medications or drugs. What do? They either activate you or sedate you. Can that be useful if you're like, now you're perked up a little bit temporarily? Potentially. Activating or sedating, up or down. Those are pretty much the options, okay? Like I'm oversimplifying. But you take a real medicine and it opens, right? Like now maybe you are open. Maybe you go back into the world and you're this degree more open. And now when someone says, I love you, like you actually feel it. Maybe when the sun is shining on your face, you actually feel it. So that's one way of looking at it.
Maybe when you're reading the modality, you feel it.
Yeah. Maybe when you're in therapy, you're like, oh, like there's a connection happening here. I'm understanding myself. I'm feeling my emotions. Like people that I've worked with who have been through tremendous abuse, and they talk about it like they're a reporter. then they have a few experiences with medicine and now they're feeling it. I remember one young woman was like, I want to be able to feel my emotions. I'm like, are you sure?
Right.
She's like, why would I not want to be able to feel my emotions? I'm like, okay. Yeah. So a few months later, we had a very different conversation, right? Because it's like she was actually feeling her emotions, right? So
Some of which weren't particularly pretty, obviously.
yeah.
Yes.
And so she's on her road of healing. How do I know that? Because I see her face is alive. I see we have a real connection now. I see she has felt feelings like a human being. She's a human being now. Now, that's not an easy road. If you were numb and you suffered a tremendous amount of abuse and now you're alive, that's why a person has to choose this path for themselves. Like if a person chooses to operate in a numbness, it's like not for me to
Right, all the power to them.
Yeah.
How can anyone
but if a
advise for
person
them?
decides they want to do whatever it takes to be alive again, isn't that what we're here for? To live life, to be alive. Doesn't every human being deserve that? So it helps us open, it helps us be alive, and it helps us see our truth. And our truth, it cannot be defined like my truth is different from your truth, right? A person has to discover their truth for themselves. But I do believe that a lot of the suffering that shows up as emotional, psychological suffering are areas of misalignment. It's like when you're not living your truth, you pay a big price for that, even if you're not aware that you're not living your truth.
1000%.
You're like running around trying to keep it all together, and it's just not actually working because the truth is a simple but narrow path. It's like if you're trying to live your truth in your head, you feel like you're on a tightrope because you're like, wait, is it this way? And you're like, you could get obsessional about it, right? But if you're actually living your truth, you're not on a tightrope. You're just like putting one foot in front of the other. Right? You can't. How do you actually live your truth if you don't have a felt experience of what that is? So if people are calloused, shut down because they've been hurt, or because they live in a culture that's overstimulating with materialism and all sorts of values that take you away from who you actually are, how are they going to get back to who they are and know themselves for the first time?
But you used an expression earlier, and it sounds like you're saying something similar now, that there may be something specific about the times we are in that are requiring medicines like this, which crack you open. Or you didn't use the word crack.
I believe that.
How would you describe that?
We have the chance. It's like we're not forced to be in survival mode all the time. Many of us are living in survival mode because of intergenerational trauma. Yes, financial strains and things like that. There are reasons, but we have a little wiggle room where like we can sit down right now and like be and have an authentic conversation. That's a privilege. Like that's been given to us. It's not an easy privilege to carry because now it means, we have to be, and we're actually carrying a lot that's been passed down to us from people who didn't have a chance to sit down and heal. So it's like the times are calling for it. And you see people are coming for it. They're asking for it because they're feeling that. They're feeling like this needs to happen, right? So I think we've been given an opportunity.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way of looking at it because when you talk about it in terms of physical luxuries, that we understand, okay, that's a luxury now.
Yeah.
When we talk about it in terms of maybe emotional or psychological luxuries, sometimes, someone from a previous generation will say, we didn't do that, so why do you have to do that?
Why do you need to do that?
We didn't do many things. You couldn't plug a car in and have it work. You couldn't order things from your phone. There are many things you couldn't do. Not that everyone has an electric car, but I'm saying there's so many things that are available to us today, and take advantage of those luxuries.
Yeah.
The fact that there are ways to earn income today that allows someone to be closer to a stay-at-home mother, but still allow for that kind of flexibility. There's so many jobs that exist today, especially post-COVID with virtual world opening up so much more, that's not a bad thing. That's beautiful. There's a luxury that affords. And then the same is true emotionally, that right now, practically speaking, some people are able to function without working 100 hours a week, which it took regardless. Like, for example, if someone was raising a family previously, and if they were working a full-time job and they needed to go shopping, just the shopping was hours and hours and hours.
Right.
I don't know how you get your food today, but most of it is
Instacart.
Instacart. Like, what does that do to a family? And so suddenly you have, let's say, 6 hours extra a week.
Right.
And let's say you took 2 of those and devoted it to a therapy session.
Yeah.
Like, is that so bad? Is that
Well, it's like when I was a good Lubavitch girl, okay? Like no college. No college. I was part of the no college committee in high school.
Yeah.
I was married to a mashpia of a Lubavitch yeshiva. It's like when I got accepted to Yale, which was very surprising because I didn't have the background. You know, some of my family members were like, "What do you need to do that for?" It's like, what do I need to do that for? What if it's part of my path as a human being? It was like there was so much hashgacha pratis. Like I bumped into the person who was supposed to interview me the night before the interview. Right? Am I supposed to make nothing of that, or was that reassuring me that this was something I was meant to do? I was there as I believed I was there as a shlucha in some way, and people can laugh at that, right? But to me, it's like, what do you mean? What do I need to do that? If I don't follow my path as a human being, what am I actually offering to the world? Who am I? It's like, we can say, what do you need that for? But the things people are drawn to, I actually saw a letter of the Rebbe recently that emphasizes that, like, the things people actually want and are passionate about are part of their calling.
100%.
It's like you dismiss that, like, what do you need that for? And you might have just you don't even know what you just shut down, right? And what you're saying in this realm is like the mentality no more is like, what do we need? It's like, what an opportunity. Like, what are we actually going to make of? Like, that's a big deal, actually. Like, I feel those extra 4 hours where I don't have to go to the grocery store, right?
But it is a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Right? When someone doesn't have the time to think about things, maybe there's parts of the world where depression, anxiety, and other there is no time for that.
You ever
There's no
notice
luxury.
in a couple that, like, when one person is having a rough time, the other person's kind of okay, and then it can flip-flop? Like, when the other person's okay, they start to struggle. It's like the system can only handle so much, right?
Okay.
So if things are okay out there, it's like, I can afford to have a little bit of a breakdown or a tantrum. Does it mean that what's coming up is excessive? Or does it mean that what's coming up had to be bottled in the whole time and now it's releasing itself, right?
Right. Now it's an opportunity for it
to be released.
For it to come to the surface.
And I believe this is the most basic and deepest level of our avaida in this world. It's like, what are we here for? Avaidas habirurim, to elevate the sparks. What does that actually mean, right?
What does it mean to you?
Refining our midas, right? Refining our humanity. Like taking our humanity and elevating our consciousness and being in a state of liberated consciousness, like being truly who we actually are. And then if we're living there, we're shining our light out into the world, and it has ripple effects.
Yeah, I was speaking to a family reached out to me about a child that was struggling with addiction, and in a conversation with them, it became very clear that one of the driving forces behind the addiction was the sense that they were living a double life. They were religious and observant on the outside, but on the inside, not at all.
Right.
And I advised them to, like, let your parents know. It's going to hurt them. It's going, all the concerns that they had, they're not going to understand. There may be other ramifications. I said, listen, I don't know about any of those things. I just know about powerful urges that we obsess over. And how to sometimes reduce those, and the 1 + 1 = 2.
Right.
Say this, you'll just be more honest in the world. You're sitting there walking around that in a way that's not honest to you,
right?
And a lot of your family is seeing that as well. And it was very tough for the parents when they heard that. And speaking to one of the parents about it, there was this sense like, this was really tough. They shouldn't have done it in this way. And aren't we here just to be like the best people we can be? And I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to argue with it. I knew it was tough for the parents to hear that. Their world was just shook. They fought so much for a religious upbringing, and to find out that their child has an addiction and then afterwards is not actually living an observant life was difficult for them.
Hard.
So I respected that and understood. On the other hand, for this individual to be boxed into, this is the best life. What is the best life?
And
were you really happy the day before when they were struggling with addiction? If you knew everything and the day before they're struggling with powerful urges, but on the outside they're observant, which sometimes the outside observant could extend to the point of having observant family and kids going to observant schools, right? Could extend to the point of their wife thinking their husband or wife thinking they're observant. Like it could go that far. It can go that far. But that reality is the best life versus maybe this one where they're not outwardly observant with everything that comes with, but the chance that they have a much better internal life.
And who is the God that we're serving here? Like, is it not the God that created this person the way they are and has a hand in the situation the way it is? Like, we're outsmarting God here. We're like, this is how God wants you to live your life. Like, we know what is true and what our relationship with God is, right? And we can be true to that within ourselves. We think our God doesn't understand how he created this other person and what they need to be real, to be okay. And like our own Torah tells us, like, fundamentally, pikuach nefesh comes before everything. And maybe that can be a slippery slope because people can be like, you're telling me that in order to not have a mental breakdown, you need to, violate. Maybe, we don't know. Meaning like a person
That
has
is
to
right.
be,
It's an individual path.
yeah,
an
an individual
journey.
person needs to be healthy and healed. And the truth, it says also in our body of wisdom, MS is the path that agrees to itself on all sides, right? Like, it's true because it's true. And in a way, it's self-evident. Like, if you don't know what is true for you yet, you're still exploring. So take your time with it. And I think that's important for people to hear because sometimes there can be external pressures to like find your truth. Like, you don't have to figure it all out today. Like, when you come to something that you see is true for you, you'll know, right? And then you have to have the courage to be clear and transparent about that. And if you're not sure yet, you don't have to figure it all out in a day. Like, explore, take your time. And just for parents out there, we're parents. I think moms feel this especially, like, for the children's sake. It's like as if the children are fundamentally different human beings than we are. Like, okay, so we're gonna fit into a box that doesn't work for us, and how is that gonna work out for the children?
I said we're doing such and such for the children's sake. I've heard this.
Meaning like I'm keeping it this way for my children. They're feeling your truth or your lack of transparency. They're feeling if there's hypocrisy or falseness, and the sensitive ones are the ones who are feeling it the most.
Whenever anyone uses that word, that phrase, that language with me, my bullshit meter goes through the roof. Mm-hmm. Always, 100% of the time. So if I'm speaking to a couple, I just have to protect my children.
Right.
Like, once you're going there,
protect them for what?
But not only for religious reasons. It could be anything. They're fighting with their ex-husband or something, and they just use that. My child needs to grow up in a world. Once you've had to resort to that to explain something, something tells me that there's something underneath.
Truth to the fact that we do sacrifice for our children, in so many different ways. But this is not the way we actually sacrifice for our children, by being false. Right? Because they smell the falseness. They're going to know it. It might take them some time to figure it out, but they'll know it eventually. Right?
But for example, let's say someone's taking a fight with their ex-husband. Say, my children need to be protected from this, that, and the other thing. If that's true, so do you.
Right.
And you can say that, and you can make the same point. Once you had to go there, you're probably going for an emotional argument that you don't want me to pick apart. So I just started telling people when they use it that my bullshit meter goes off when they use it, and let's try a different way. It may not be bullshit, it just triggered it. So we don't want to trigger my bullshit meter, God forbid. It's a very dangerous
BS
thing.
meter is a really good way, I think, of thinking about some of the things you were talking about before, because I feel like people with disordered eating, borderline traits, their BS meter does not let as much to function well here in our time. It helps to have a BS meter that lets you get away with quite a lot of BS. Like, it helps to be able to tolerate a lot of BS, to function well.
100%, yes.
And people who have a low BS threshold, like they need a lot of truth, they suffer more. So that's another reason why I love borderline traits, because it's like ultimately coming from a place of, I need truth. Like, I'm not going to settle for BS.
But invariably, when parents call me about one child who's struggling, and again, a lot of my conversations are around porn addiction or sex addiction or something in that realm, and I'll say, like, are your other kids dealing with this? Like, no, it's just this one. I said, let me guess, he or she was your most sensitive child.
Yeah.
It says, yeah, they actually were. I said,
right.
It's 100% of the time. It always is. Why?
Because they're picking up what's there, right?
Yeah,
that's
100%.
What you see so clearly. It's like, we have bought into an illusion that the pathology exists within a human being who we've identified as a problem, right? It's like they are tapping into something that is here. to me, this seems like a fundamental truth and empowering and humbles us all. Like, if we're going to go there to help, so to speak, someone, like, we better actually respect them. You know, we better truly actually be humbled by their level of sensitivity and their level of openness, and be coming from a place of like, I want to understand you more because what you have to say is actually of interest to me and the world.
Understood. Let's dive a little bit into the psychedelic realm.
Okay.
Okay, because when I first began talking about it, I thought that certainly
How
within
much
the
time do
Orthodox,
we have? No, I'm just
well, as
kidding.
much as needed. I thought that originally when I'd be going into it,
Yeah.
I'd be met with more resistance and be more explaining. But in fact, I don't feel that case at all within the Orthodox community. I find myself more like pulling people back a little bit, like easy.
Reins.
Yeah, yeah. More using the reins than using the like, hey, like this is what's needed. It's definitely out there. People are talking about it. People are using it. Some people have had positive experience, difficult experiences. Some people had many. Some people had one and done.
Right.
On. What if someone's listening to this, right? And obviously, it's very difficult because a lot of this stuff is the legality is changing, like
Right.
literally from when we record this till it gets posted. There could be several.
We're making history here.
There could be several different cities that, whatever, that legalize or decriminalize, or like there's so many different things, going on. So it's difficult to say like you would with EMDR. Just look up a EMDR therapist in your area. Go find, one or two referrals, and then based on that have an experience with it. There isn't that. So it's going to be difficult to come to the point like, hey, call this person at this number and book an appointment. But what are some of the things, if someone is interested and someone is looking at, what are some guideposts along the way or recommendations, advice on this that you can offer?
Haste makes waste, right? Haste makes waste. Like, take your time, Meaning, like, if you're in a rush, it's like, it'll backfire at some point, like, there's a sense of urgency, like, do what needs to be done, right? But don't rush it. Like, take your time, make a decision that comes from your center, from your heart. Counsel with wise people who have been there before. Take your time and set up a situation that is thoughtful, intentional, conducive to healing. And we've talked about this offline, like, connect with a practitioner who is worthy of trusting because they're going there with you. So choose wisely. And how do you choose wisely? Because ideally, we would have a really solid system built on MS and truth that would guide people to practitioners who are truly trustworthy, right? But we know, like, the psychiatric system or other systems, like, a lot of people go into it because of for their own agenda.
Yes, like everything else.
Like everything else, right? But when it comes to healing, it's especially important because people are coming for help in a vulnerable state. And there's the power differential can be really dangerous because you're going into subtle terrain. Like, you're going into emotional, energetic, psychological healing. So it cannot be a relationship where power is being abused, even in subtle ways.
Correct.
Power cannot even be abused to have the healer feel good about themselves that they helped you. That's already an abuse of power, right?
You're saying in any relationship or specifically?
Healing relationship.
Any healing relationship.
Any healing relationship, even in therapy. But when you go into this realm, everything is
magnified,
open, amplified, sensitive. So now you're getting very open and into very sensitive, and abuse of power can happen much more quickly and in much more sensitive ways. So how do you weed that out, right? How do you find MS, essentially? How do you discern?
MS meaning truth. How do we find truth?
How do you find truth? First of all, truth, you usually know it when you see it. Problem is, if you've been very traumatized and you're
then
accustomed,
you won't know it when you see it.
Yeah, that's where
maybe just the opposite.
Yeah, that's where you have to advise with people who are actually wise, right? Who you actually respect the way they're living their lives. I think in this realm, the truth is, like, you can't hide from the truth here. Meaning you can't just look somebody up for their credentials, and it's good that you can't, because it means you have to find someone who are living lives that actually look like lives you might want to live. Like, is the person actually happy? Do they actually seem at peace, right? It's like, we are so conditioned to go into a psychiatrist's office, charges $750, because they see the whole from community and have the best credentials, and ignore the fact that when we're in their office, we feel like we're not treated like a human being. Like 15 minutes, the tone is very dismissive. They know what our problems are. Here are the medications. We ignore all of that valuable information that is coming at us. When you're around this person, do you feel important? Do you feel valued? Do you feel loved? Do you feel like they're there for you? So I'm trying to tell people to trust their own experience with a practitioner, seek counsel from people who they actually see as wise, whose lives they actually would want to live, and trust their reputation in a real sense, not like their reputation on social media, their reputation of what are the results that have actually been seen from people who have worked with them before, right?
Right. And it's not saying I had a good experience. It's seeing someone who's living a life you want to
Heal.
live
Yeah.
and saying part of that was
Yeah.
by working through this person. So let's take an even further step back, because I understand what you're saying here with the fact that psychedelics have the opportunity to open. And that's very important when someone is cold, callous, closed off,
Right.
or needs some sort of dose of truth. But that openness also invites all sorts of other things, open and
Abuse.
vulnerability, whether it's
Yeah.
abuse, like you said, abuse of power, but there's all sorts of other things that could be mixed in there, right?
Right.
That's maybe not even an abuse of power, just someone doing it alone. How many people do I hear? Okay, I guess, like, where can I get some of this stuff? I'll just do it alone.
Right.
If psilocybin is good and it's at 0.8, then can I just buy some and take it and everything will be...
Well, if like people want to recreate, like if people want to have
I'm
recreational
not talking recreation. They want a deep
but if
healing
people want to
experience.
have a deep healing experience, it's like, so what does it take to experience deep healing? If you're going to go in to open up, what are you actually opening up?
So let's take
Two.
even a further step back. What kind of people would you say? And I know you said this is an individual process, right? Someone
Yeah.
has to choose, do I want to live numb or do I want to live open? And that's not like, oh, do you want $1 million? You want to be broke? No,
Right.
there's a very valid reason
Right.
to live numb. And there's because
Right.
the process of having felt experiences is going to go through some incredible pain
Yeah.
that no human being has the right to choose for the other
For you.
person.
Yeah.
Hey, you just go through that.
Go for it. It'll be
Go
fine.
through that healing journey.
See you on the other side.
Right. Let's see what happens. So what if someone is thinking about it?
Yeah.
What might they be experiencing in their life that they say, hey, this maybe is what that you would say, maybe this is something you should consider,
Yeah.
that this can help you.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but I really feel like people know when they're ready to do this work. And usually when they're ready, they're like, I'm ready. Like, I am actually ready. How can you
So
determine?
you're speaking to that person. That's good enough
Yeah.
for me. Okay,
Yeah,
you
no,
speak to
I'm
that
speaking
person.
to that person
The
like
person feels ready.
eye to eye, and we're having an actual conversation. Eye to eye. Oh, there's the audience. About like, we're speaking. If I don't like emerge from that conversation with a felt sense that this person is ready, like I'm not going to encourage it. And I'm not a gatekeeper to these experiences. Nobody is. No human being is a gatekeeper to these experiences.
One way or the other, either open the gate
Yeah,
or
but
close
if
the
they're
gate.
coming to a human being, then that human being has a responsibility to use their own discernment, their own intuition, and their own felt sense of knowing, and to be open and transparent with the other person as to whether they're encouraging them in this direction or encouraging them in a different direction. But
But that's an important point, because there are some people who become evangelists for it and are pushing people for it. You're
Right.
saying, hey, like, this is a very, very individual process. When someone is ready, that will be
yeah,
a felt sense. They'll know.
right. I would say I would err on the side of the opposite. It's like if someone's coming for it, it's like, maybe, take your time. Let's talk next week, and you'll see if they're actively reaching out. That will give you more information about their level of readiness, right? So
Right.
I approach it as like, I understand people are in pain and they do need help. And sometimes there's an emergency where there's a reason to step in really quickly. But generally it's like haste makes waste in this process. It's like, it is happening essentially on an intuitive level. Like if you haven't yet developed the capacity to have intuition around what's right for this person, maybe you're not the right practitioner for them. Just say, I don't know. Send them to someone who might know.
Okay, so at that point that someone feels ready, they don't have that question, So the number one, you're saying don't rush too fast. Number two is find a practitioner to work with who's worked with other people who are in a place that you want to be.
Yeah.
Not who are singing their praises like this was amazing.
Yeah, like I had a great
But-
time that one, right? I had a great experience. Like, let's see how it plays out in their real life,
Right.
right? Yeah.
Right. If I
Ideally.
see this person in a place where I want to get to,
Yeah.
then no problem.
It's amazing. You know, you were saying it's amazing that you have to explain these things, right? Like, it seems painfully obvious. Like, you're going to someone for emotional healing. Are you going to seek out someone who's living a life that seems emotionally healed? But so many people are going to practitioners like on the basis of their credentials. And if you actually look at them in the eye, like they may seem unwell, they may seem tormented. If you're going to them for like experience in business or like even in maybe some other specific version of medical or surgical intervention, okay. But if you're going for them for emotional healing, don't you want to have a sense?
I don't think it's different. Actually, I don't think it's different.
It's not different.
It's not different. The amount of times that I counsel people just this specific thing. Ask advice from people who are where you want to be.
Right.
I had someone come to me for business advice, and in talking to and asking me, it was clear that they were also talking to someone else. So I said, who is the other person you're talking to? What is their situation? And it was
Yeah.
specifically related to business. And it was so different than where I am in my career and what I've done and everything
Right.
else. And I said, I don't understand how you can be talking to
Right.
both of us, because what I'm going to tell you, I can't tell you whether my life is more ideal than his life for you. When I
Right.
say, obviously neither is, but which one are you trying to model more?
Right.
Right? I have a very boring, dull business.
Right.
I distribute products, widgets, and things like that I've been doing for nearly 20 years, and slowly year to year, just trying to, incrementally grow the business and organize it and structure it. And I've pretty much been doing the same thing for close to 20 years. This other person you're talking to is traveling 8 to 10 months out of the year, networking and investing in a bunch of different opportunities.
Right.
Right. And you're asking us and you're asking each of us,
Both of us. Right.
each of us separately, what you,
They're ambivalent about whether they want to be successful. So
is that so, like, which life do you want?
Yeah.
Which life do you want? In terms, like, that person has richness of experiences for sure.
right.
And instability and from the way I look at it, is like an unstableness to the life everywhere, but amazing experience, amazing contacts, amazing relationships, exciting businesses and opportunities that they've worked on.
Right.
Right. But that comes at, right.
Sometimes people want to keep it all. Like my
Well,
son
if you
was-
want both, you're going to have neither.
Yeah, you're gonna have neither.
Right.
That's like my son was saying the Dvar Torah of like Ad Masayatem Paischem Al Shteyasefim, like how long
Right.
are you gonna be bouncing around two
Elijah's
bummas?
right. Elijah
Like,
screamed to the
you want the bumma of truth or you want a different bumma? Like pick
100%.
your path. So actually, sometimes I come across that because I still can prescribe psychiatric medications, and sometimes people like want to have it all.
right. Go back.
I don't know how that's going to work out for them. It's like at a certain point, you want to go down the path of healing. Yeah, the path of healing is beautiful and also treacherous. Like, it takes courage. You know, at a certain point, you have to kind of decide you want to go down that route, and then you're kind of going downstream. You're like, you're
and
in
it's
for the ride.
unpredictable.
And you can't blame anyone for how hard it is. Like, you take yourself there, right?
100%. Right. So
It's-
just to finish this point,
yeah.
I think that that's something everyone should do in all areas of life, whether it's business or recovery. Within
Well,
recovery, what do they always say?
Yeah.
They say, choose someone who has something that you want and
Right.
ask them to be your sponsor.
Shockingly,
They are-
wisdom is very
right.
much like common sense.
Right.
It's like it
They are where you
applies
wanna
here
be.
too.
So you're saying the same thing, right? It's like,
Yeah. I was
should I
talk-
work with this practitioner? Look at the results. Look at the fruits of their labor.
I was talking to a friend who's a respected physician. He reminded me of the Torah's principles on checking someone's qualifications: hasmada, smicha, and shimash.
Okay, so for someone who doesn't, because not all of our audience.
Diligent study
So this is a process within Orthodox Judaism.
for assessing
credentialing someone.
Credentialing, yeah.
Okay, way before there were
University
therapeutic boards or
degrees,
universities
yeah.
or degrees. Okay, how we know?
So diligent study, smicha, so it was
Mentorship,
passed down,
right.
mentorship, accountability, and experience. It's like you can't really those are pretty rock solid principles, right? You get into the details, it can get sticky, like who did they get mentorship from, right? But it's the same principles apply. Seek someone who seeks mentorship from someone whose life you respect. Ensure that they did their due diligence, like inquire about their training and experience in education. It may not be the same kind of training and experience in education we recognize, because we may not have a frame of reference for very valid ways of education that are outside of our culture, but
Right.
at least you have some basic understanding that they've done their due diligence. Like they have not bypassed, they have not skipped steps. Sometimes people skip steps for valid reasons. Like sometimes people are just prodigies at something. Like, so it's just worthy of questioning. It's not saying you're going to dismiss them on that basis alone. And I came to the conclusion that there's no shortcut to the verification process here. Like, you have to explore everything, all the information you have, and be diligent about it. You know, like the joke was like the doctor says, don't mistake your Google research with my education. So the patient says, don't mistake your hour lecture on my condition with my life experience living the condition.
Right. Right.
So it's like, don't dismiss your own discernment and knowledge and research. But like, don't think because you researched ayahuasca for 10 hours on Google, like you got it down, right? Like, be wise about it.
Okay, so go into it carefully, experience, get personal recommendations from people who are where you want to be. You used words like it could be treacherous.
Yeah.
All right. So if someone gets it wrong?
Even if you get it right, because it's like people get, I think, enamored by the idea of healing. It's like we could be sitting up here and we're not putting ourselves on a pedestal here, but the pedestal or the platform can be exciting. Like, I'm going to go on my healing journey. It sounds pretty, there's what to be enamored by. But it's like people fail to appreciate that. It's like, do you get excited about going to the dentist to get a cavity pulled? That's what needs to happen. And it hurts. It's like goopy. You come out feeling like this. It's like you do it because it needs to get done, right? Like, do people get excited about the idea of clearing out their psycho-emotional, spiritual immune system? Like really cleaning out the pipes, like finding out what's there and sitting with all the gunk until you figure out a way to clean it up.
Right.
It's like when you call your plumber to clear out your pipes, you recognize this is important. Otherwise, we will have bigger problems if we don't clear out the pipes. But it's not like you look forward to the day when your house starts, there are like odors and, right? Like the dirt
Right.
is in the air, right? So it's like to have an awareness that this is what we're talking about. We're talking about clearing out, refining. It's messy. There are many moments that are unglamorous, that are dark. Ultimately, you're actually on your own because, it's like eme non ili mili, like
Right.
there will be dark moments when like the hand will not, you will need to like take yourself through it, find
Right.
your own breath, find your own hand. And it's like, sign yourself up with your eyes wide open to that.
When you talk about psychedelics, and then you also mentioned something, plants and nature and stuff like that. So do you make a distinction between things like psilocybin and ayahuasca, which come from nature, and things like MDMA and ketamine, which are also getting thrown into the psychedelic?
That's where I've actually moved away from ketamine personally. As I said, there are many paths and routes to healing. It just, for me, very simply, a medicine that comes from the earth, just like food that comes from the earth, is just different to me than a medicine that's highly processed. Like the same way a food that's highly processed is different than a food that's closer to the source.
Right. I agree. I found the same thing. I think that there are a lot of chemicals that healers use, and I understand why.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes they reduce the harshness and the immediacy of the work during the session.
Yeah.
But then I find that afterwards there's an overhang. As an example, like MDMA therapy or stuff like that has potentially a softer, it could be very emotional and, heart opening, and like not in always a beautiful way, in a very emotional, tearing apart way. However, it's much softer, more contained, and less, and it doesn't have nearly as many choices like possibilities, range of
Where you can
experiences,
go.
right, as an ayahuasca experience.
Mm.
But an ayahuasca experience, you're unlikely to feel depressed 2 days later. Where an MDMA session, like there always seems to be an overhang afterwards. So it seems like, let me reduce the impact of this is at least what I've seen, let me reduce the impact of the immediate experience, but sacrifice
This reminds me of
something
when my
after
mom
that.
would tell me to get an epidural in labor. And I was like, I want the full experience. It's like, that's a personal choice, you know? So like maybe people need different things depending on where they're at. But ultimately, like if you're overriding the system with something artificial, that's what you're doing. It's like
Right.
the closer it is to real, the more embodied the experience is, the more work you do to earn your healing, the more real it is. Generally, if it's real, it's more likely to be lasting. And if it's from the earth, on some level, it's more likely to interact in a peaceful way with the human being, which also comes from the earth. It's like common sense here, but in our era, it might sound a little green or far out, but it's like the reality. Like we are human beings. Like something that's highly processed is just much farther removed from the source. No, and it depends on a person's sensitivity. It also depends on what they can tolerate. Some people need a way in, and they're not in a place where they can tolerate, like they need more support.
Sure.
And also, like clinically speaking, you know, there are people who maybe their level of, you know, destabilization, it's like they already have enough destabilization to begin with, and they need things to help contain them. You know, like we may cynically say that the standard is Band-Aids, like antidepressants or something more. It's like a Band-Aid. But there's a place for a Band-Aid. It's like oozing all out. You need a Band-Aid, it's some containment. So it's like, think about this opening. Not everyone needs an opening, or maybe it's not the right time for an opening for them. So to really use sense when we're thinking about what does a person need, like not to include our own biases or our own agendas, even if they're coming from a good place.
Right.
Right? Like if a person needs containment, well, we start there and then one step at a time, right? People are always also asking, like, not always, but often asking, okay, like, well, what's the plan over the next year for me? Like, you're right, like, let's make a treatment plan. It's like, you had to kind of move from A to B before you know what B looks like. You know, so I know it's hard to grapple with uncertainty, but I'd be lying if I came up with a 1-year plan for you. I don't know. Like, we're actually in this together. So we're like, let's make a solid plan to go from here to there and then see where we're at.
Right. It's like you have a lot of experience with other people that may influence working with this one person, but you have no experience working with this one person. On this
and,
thing.
I mean, in this realm, it's like you learn so much from every human being that you work with. It's like you're in a different place. When they're at B, like you're in a different place. Like you don't want to plan C until you're at B, because you have much richer, more useful information when you're there, when you've grown together already.
Got it. Where do you see it going? If you psychedelic healing, and where it was just in research 10 years ago, and now it's in the vernacular and in the conversation. There is something that I think about often is, you know, for those who are pro it, like I would consider myself pro it, right? By and large, doesn't mean in every situation, doesn't mean everyone, and doesn't mean in every way, but certainly pro it. For those who are like it, it's like, let's not forget, there was something that happened 50 or 60 years ago where there was also the research and also the positive experiences and also a lot of people who were healing.
Right.
But it did spin out of control, and enough people said...
You know the expression, history doesn't actually repeat itself. It's more like a poem. It's like a refrain. Like we keep coming back to something that seems quite similar to what the last line, like it rhymes, history rhymes. It's like, let's learn. Let's like pay attention to our mistakes. You know, let's actually learn from them. I don't know what...
Right, like if you want to say like whose fault was it, right?
Yeah.
That psychedelics became illegal.
Iris without kalim. You know, like Hasidus would say light without vessels.
Right.
Like err on the side of creating solid vessels, because then what you pour in is going to like be contained. I hope we're going to put work into what actually really matters, because like we said before, if you give someone an opening experience, they go home to a family they feel alienated in and a community that doesn't feel like a community. How are they really going to grow? I mean, honestly, the people I see really being successful are the people who have figured out a way to find loving relationships in their lives already, or they use the work they're doing to create loving relationships. But for people who are seeing the truth and then going home to a place where they feel like they don't belong, that's really a rough, very deep, that's really hard. Like my heart goes out. It's really, and that I think it can break a person, you know, to see like possibility and then come back home and feel like they don't have a home to come home to. So the home to come home to is like what I hope we invest our energy into. Some would
Do you
call
mean
that,
like the community healing?
some would call that integration, like meaning like a place a person can go to and like land, make sense, be heard. But yeah, I do mean in a bigger way, like communities, like how are we going to move from where we are to people living in a state of belonging, not just in their family unit, but in our bigger communities. Yeah. I think I see that starting to happen.
That's what I see as well.
yeah.
And I think that's the responsibility of those people who've embarked on this path a little bit earlier, is to say, okay, there was mistakes 50 or 60 years ago that led a lot of very sensible people to say like, hey, we got to put these tools back in a box. Let's call it, I mean, to go so far as to say that these substances have no medicinal research
supporting their use.
Like nothing. You can't even get into a clinical trial for this stuff 50 or 60 years ago. There was nothing. It was zero. And then obviously the culture followed suit, and the way people spoke about it. There was a reason why. It wasn't like they were so crazy and we're so smart.
And there was
also enough going on there.
Yeah. And there's also a lot of fear of loss of control. If people become empowered and healed, like what is that going to look like?
But there was also a lot of research and a lot of success.
Yeah. A lot of
There were things that were going well.
But you're saying there was also reason to being like, all right, human
then
beings are not, like we're not ready. Let's put it away.
We did not. There's no way you can tell me that we utilized the tools correctly 50 or 60 years ago and they just got outlawed. That wasn't the story.
Right.
There was a lot of promise. There was a lot of healing, and it spun out of control. I spoken to people who've embarked on this path for no reason other than curiosity.
Right.
Like, you got to be insane. Like what you say.
Or fun.
What?
I mean, fun is good, but like...
I'm not talking about at a festival doing some things. It's just, I'm going to go to a retreat. Why? Because someone else said that as well. Or they were sitting at a table and 4 of the 6 people who were there all had done ayahuasca retreats. Gone to Ecuador, Peru, or something else for a week and said, hey, me too. I know someone who went into an experience and got pulled into a vision of themselves getting woken up in the middle of the night and beaten by their father. I said, I want you to put your hand on this mezuzah, and whipped him with the hanger and said, don't take your hand off the mezuzah until it bleeds. Right. And that was the experience he got pulled into. This guy was in a psych ward in 2 months. Right. He was unprepared completely for that experience. There was no container. There was no nothing. He wasn't even planning on this. It was no intention of it.
I'm going to share another.
And it was done in a very recreational setting where someone had a positive experience with something and said, hey, why don't you try this?
Right.
Had that same person spent 3 to 4 months researching,
right,
on trying to figure out why certain things weren't right in life, which obviously it was. This guy wasn't walking through life and everything was perfect, and then one day the left turned into a psych ward. Of course not. There was a lot that was unstructured and not working in his life in many, many different ways. However, the person who introduced him to psychedelics didn't think through all of those things and said, okay, so he's here struggling and the goal is to get them there. And it's possible these tools could. Not only possible these tools could, it's possible that exact experience could have in a different context.
In a different context.
Had he made the decision to go in there, had he had certain preliminary conversations with someone who understood like, hey, there's something deep, because some of that could have been pulled apart before in conversation, said, hey, like, we understand we're going into something. This could be very heavy. This could be deep. And then 3 hours after the experience, you're not going to be back in your house a block away from your from your father, who you just found out wasn't who you thought he was for the last 30 years.
Right. Yeah, proceed with your eyes wide open and ensure that it is your own decision. Like, don't do this for anybody else but you. Like this, and don't do it under the influence of somebody else. Like, you can take other people's input into account, but then come to a place where it's actually your own decision. Because once you go there, I mean, you're taking full responsibility at the end of the day. Like, even your practitioner, like, yeah, they're taking on a level of responsibility that's really important. But you're taking responsibility to live with yourself. It's like you can run, but you can't hide, but you're still going to be with you. And it's like, there's a reason your system is keeping certain things under wraps right now, right? Like, there is a reason we have an ego and defense mechanisms and a conscience and right? Like, this is like playing with fire to a certain degree, yes, because why do we think it is this way? Why do we think certain things only come up in our dreams or don't come up at all? Maybe
Right.
because they need to be contained in out of our awareness so that we can be okay, that we can be safe in our own systems, right? And if we are going to open up the can of worms, so to speak, which we may need to do for very good reasons, like, let's be open, let's have our eyes open and not be in any level of delusion, illusion, right? Or shifting responsibility externally, like taking it our own, stepping into our agency first, right?
Understood. What are some of maybe a cautionary tale or two,
Yeah.
like some things that
Well, I was going to give a cautionary tale about, without giving much detail, like, this was a situation where the person had what would look like a very healing therapeutic experience, but they kind of came back from it and they were like, I want my old life back. It was like when you're talking to Danny in his period of like a couple years of kind of starting from scratch, like
Daniel Resnick, yeah.
topsy-turvy. It's like this person came out with that awareness, but they were adamant that they did not want to rebuild. Like, now they see they were suffering, they were stuck, but they don't want to put in the work to grow. And that experience was very, very hard for them to come back from. This is like they no longer.
So what motivated them to go in?
They wanted to stop. They wanted to shift with a specific addiction. They wanted to overcome that without the healing. Right? So that's a good example of like they were not adequately prepared, because you
Right.
can't go into this experience being like, I want to use this to stop drinking alcohol, but I don't want to do any other healing. Like, that's not how it works, right? So that was the mistake in that situation. So now let's say it wasn't alcohol, but let's say no longer could rely on alcohol because it didn't work for him anymore. It did fix that. But he could not
But he also didn't
come
have anything else.
to grips with doing the work, and he had nothing else. It was like he was not functional.
I wish I could go backwards a little bit.
Yeah.
I understand that. So you're saying even within a positive experience and on the outside, you'd look at it, or
Yeah.
anyone else would look at it and say like,
Like, he got
hey,
what he
who would
wanted
want
out of
this?
it.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
he didn't.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So
No, he
that's
didn't.
a cautionary tale. I mean, I worked with a woman who was out of the country, and after having I have no idea what context she was drinking medicine in, but she kind of did not land back into reality for weeks, and in the process got caught up in a very difficult, some would say toxic relationship where like neither of them had landed, and a lot of harm was done to her in that context. And she ended up involuntarily hospitalized, brought back to the States, and I worked with her after she was hospitalized, and that was extremely traumatic for her.
Right.
And they diagnosed her with schizophrenia, which she didn't have, because they had no frame of reference for what had happened to her. That was very traumatic for her. So that was a long road back for her. That was really hard.
Right.
But-
So talk about, what steps could have been taken?
See,
to-
there, I have
prevent
no
that.
idea what was going on with the medicine there. I only got introduced to her after this had all happened. But
So you think that was someone that possibly with good intentions, but
Yeah.
just understood what they were getting into to a degree,
yeah, and had somewhere to go home.
but
to.
just wasn't working with the right people and didn't
Yeah.
have the support.
She had nowhere to go home to. So when she was acting out, someone called like the ambulance. It's like if someone is having a bit of if they're losing it after an experience, that can be very normal. And if the people around them are there to contain it and be with them through it, nobody's calling the cops or the ambulance, right? So she didn't have support. She didn't have basic support,
Right.
right?
Right.
So that's a really important piece. It's like, where is the person coming home to, right? Like, what is the foundation of stability that they can land into? Are they coming home to at least some people who are going to empower them on their journey? Because if everyone around them they're coming home and everyone around them is like, I can't believe you just did that. That's going to be really hard on the system. Also, is there some basic, I mean, this is hard because some people are really struggling, but is there a basic capacity to hold paradox in the system, in the body? Like, are they aware of how to be with their breath? Be okay with distractions, right? Be okay with not doing anything to fix their difficult emotions, like basic mindfulness, right? Capacity for basic self-regulation. right? Some loving relationships, it's like an important baseline. And like
Before going in.
yeah, and if you skip those steps, like maybe there are situations where it can work out, but I think that's not an exhaustive list of what to look for before, but it really makes sense to work on that before. Like
Right.
it's not going to hurt to work on that before, and it could be really vital.
Right. What I see a lot of, but I also see it changing, is the people having experiences that are very much within the realm of what does happen on these experiences, but but they think that like they've gone through something unique in some way.
Right.
Like why is it so
nobody
difficult for
understands
me?
how hard it is for me.
Exactly.
Right. You're like, yeah.
Like they're understanding when everyone else talked about it, like, oh wow, like you swear by ayahuasca, that means it was good from beginning to end and easy from beginning to end, and
right.
like, or you came out of the experience.
Like they assume they're the only one who
exactly.
has had this level of difficulty or this amount of amazing experience, and they assume they're somewhat special in some way. We're all looking to be told we're special, right? It's like either via diagnosis or some major accomplishment. The big news is we're all amazing and we're all just people, right? So like someone's going through their experience and they get stuck in that, like, I'm special because I'm having the most intense experience that anyone has ever had. It's like they don't yet realize that we're all in this together. Like everyone who has walked this path has, for some, confronted their own darkness and demons. So it's like, but sometimes people have to figure that out for themselves. Like they have to go through the phases.
Right, 100%. Right. And that's where I think a lot of community comes in, that as they're, the 12 steps are something you can read in a book, and you can work on it one-on-one with the sponsor.
Right.
The meetings, which everyone talks about, there isn't really 12 steps being worked on in the meetings.
Right.
You may have one person pop up and share an experience. You may even have a whole meeting specifically around that theme.
Right.
But the actual work of a step will always be done one-on-one, either with oneself or one-on-one with a
I said sometimes
person.
People have to learn it for themselves. The truth is, all the time we have to learn it for ourselves. It's like, how many times have we been told the same wisdom over and over, right? Then at a certain point in our life, it starts to resonate. Like, oh yeah, what just happened, right? It's like we learned it for ourselves, right? Like, and to what degree does it help to be told the wisdom from somebody else? I mean, sometimes it's really useful. Like if someone tells you go this way, not that way, and they save you like a winding trip through the thorns, right? Like sometimes a little bit of wisdom from someone else really goes a long way. But ultimately, like life is a brutal teacher. It's like we have to learn the lessons
for
ourselves.
But if we didn't think we can shorten the path a little bit, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Exactly.
Right? We could.
Yeah.
Right.
That's where
interrupt, intercept.
Wisdom is like, you have wisdom, someone taps into it for themselves. Then they put it into like a book. Someone else reads it. It's like, that could be a big shortcut, right? Ultimately, this other person will still have to walk their own path. And there are certain steps that don't come with shortcuts. But having a shortcut is like, we ought to be very grateful for that. And with
Is psychedelics a shortcut?
It's a powerful tool.
Powerful tool. You feel it's a shortcut?
It's not what comes to mind.
Oh, right.
Yeah. It's like I was already thinking back to, you were describing the person with the father and the mezuzah. It's like sometimes you meet people when they're just going through their beginning of religious trauma. It's like they want to break out and if they take their time, it's like their story becomes much more powerful as they settle into their own coming to terms with it and reconnecting with it on their own terms. Because if people are like coming from a place of mocking tradition, it's like the tradition is what we were just describing. Like the books people have written to show you what they've already learned. And they're like, here, I'm giving you a gift, right? Like this is the gift of wisdom. So you can take your learning to the next level. Because if you already taken the wisdom that's already here in the world, that's already been figured out, now you can go even farther. Like, midgets on giants' shoulders.
100%.
So it's like everything you hear about healing is worth taking seriously. And also we're having this conversation, but it's not just verbal. It's not just information. It's also connection. Like the therapy works not just because you're sharing wisdom with someone. It's also because in the therapy, there's actual human connection actually happening in real time.
Right. It's not just a being. There's a...
Yeah. But even books, it's like that.
There's a connection that happens. Absolutely.
There's a connection that happens, and it's like an opportunity to actually absorb wisdom and can be like, thank you. It's like we get a little triggered is the word when people tell us what to do. But if we're really humble about it, it's like they're literally just sharing what they feel is wisdom. So it's like we could take it in. If it resonates, we can build on that. If it doesn't work for us, we could filter it out. Right?
100%.
Yeah.
And that's why doing it in this format is great, because we're just chatting and anyone can hit play, rewind, repeat.
Take it or leave it.
Or don't listen at all.
Yeah.
Right? It's all good. But I hope that we covered a lot of different subjects here. It was very informative, elucidating for me. I hope that the people who listen to this get a lot from it as well.
Yeah. I just want to say that I just have so much respect for people who are seeing this as an opportunity, right? Because it's like the people who come to this work for real, it's like, wow, they really humble themselves and like put themselves aside, and we all benefit from it. I just feel really grateful that we're having this conversation and that we've kept up the conversation for this long. And like we both know, so many people's lives have already been touched by that.
100%.
Ourselves like at the center of that. So grateful to anyone who's having this conversation with us. Thank you, Ellie.
I do want to say one thing. I thought of it before, and we'll add this to the conversation. But in terms of practitioners, so a practitioner who I do respect told me that like he sees his main role as getting out of the way of the process.
Yeah, love that.
And which is like, what does that mean? Getting out of the like what?
Right.
what does that actually mean? And what happens is that in a lot of these healing processes, which could be appropriate, let's say in a therapeutic setting, for the person who's coming to the therapist and wants something there.
Yeah.
But when there's a plant introduced or something else, the more that other person can step aside and say like, okay, what's happening. This person was opened up and now being connected to a truth that's for them. The less of the smaller amount, and obviously we're people, right? So we're not going to get to zero, but could I reduce 90% of the noise? Can I reduce 99% of the noise? And that's the continuous work of the process. And that's where I think, a lot of the question comes around. We didn't go too deep into it around idol worship.
Right.
But this is where I think like the concern of the idol worship comes in, like what it actually is. So oftentimes synonymous with idol worship is a guru that attaches themselves to this. It's not like, did you give...
Right.
Did you say this as
cow?
Right. Yeah. It's not that. It's that, did someone use this tool in such a way as to suggest that they were the ones...
They're the healer.
...who did that.
Yeah.
And if they did, what they did is by enabling them to not add too much noise. That's what they did.
Right.
Like you want to say, like, this guy did such a good job. What did he do? He didn't mix into it.
Right.
Like, for example... I don't know if this is true, but the idea is
he was such a great practitioner. I didn't even notice him.
Right. That's
what
I've heard, and I don't know if it's true, but the point is there that almost every single accident on an airplane happens when a pilot goes off of autopilot. Right. Like the
one problem we have in the world is human beings.
Right. The role, right. But the role is to be able to sit there through the chaos, right, and say like, they got like this was built correctly and just let it go.
Right.
It's going to land the plane. And the amount of like for a practitioner to watch what's going on and not mix in unnecessarily, to save, to touch, to try to, there's so many different ways that one can do it.
Right.
And to say, okay, my job is to keep this person physically safe, but it's not to sit there and introduce whatever I think is I have into them. And it's certainly not to suggest that the healing power that they just got from being opened up by something that's been in nature for thousands of years is because of me. And then that's how the guru comes about. That's how the gurus come about, because someone just had an amazing experience and there was just enough introduced subtly into that conversation suggests that this is the person. The question is that how do you separate that from saying this is a good practitioner? What's the difference between a good practitioner and a guru? Stay tuned for
Okay.
Paradox.
Okay.
Hold that together. Do you have that answer?
This is the most profound part. This is like why when they were at Har Sinai, they started in with Moshe's not back, we need a calf. What were they freaking out about?
Go ahead.
Right? What were they actually freaking out about, right? It's like we all know that we need human beings, right? But we are actually willing to give our power away to another human being and worship. Forget idol worship. We are willing to be like, this is my hero. This is my rabbi. this is my guru, right? Like we're
Right.
willing to be like, I'm going to ask them everything, because then we don't need to actually take accountability for how we're living our lives. Now, this is the subtle art of healing. Like there's no way to encapsulate it, because it's like if you're intervening but you're in doubt, or you're doing it to reassure yourself that you're still the healer, you might as well be gone. Like you're better off not being there. But if you're intervening from a place of love and intuition, and in that point, you're not thinking about intervening. You're just helping. That's all
Right.
you're doing. You're no longer thinking about it. It's like, how do you know you're really doing it when you're not thinking about doing it? And how do you know you're really playing an instrument, right? It's like you practice, and when you're practicing, you're like thinking about it. But when you're really in the zone, you're playing the instrument. A healing is an art. It's like when the healer is actually in their art, they are basically gone. They're like in flow, right?
Which is often what we say about like a tzaddik, right? Someone who's reached the highest level of
Yeah.
righteousness. They're on the level of a
Right.
chariot, right?
Yeah, or like, what is it? They were joking, like, I'm more of a mevutal.
Right.
I have more bittul, you have more bittul. Like, who has more bittul? Like, the paradox is you cannot grasp at self-nullification. You can't chase it. You can't force it or desire it. You have to actually not want it, and then it sneaks up behind you, and before you know it, you're in a state of self-nullification, right?
Right.
So it's like, this is all the healer's inner work. That's what this all is. Like,
Interesting.
are they actually doing their own inner work, right?
Right. Throughout this work, right?
Yeah.
I like the way you started, the way like you introduced at the beginning was, can you hold paradox?
Right.
Can you hold the fact that there's such a thing as someone who is not a guru, but at the same point in time, you need a good practitioner? Is that possible?
Yeah.
And if you could, you may just be ready.
You may just be ready to
For a
find the
world of
practitioner
parachute.
who's right for you.
Exactly.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank
for joining. I'm sure we'll do this again. And for those who want to reach out to you, contact you, want to know more, work with you, anything else, what's the
Email?
emails? You
Yeah.
want to, I guess we'll include it in the
Sure.
notes. You have a website, Instagram, you're on any of those fancy things? No.
No.
No, email.
Email.
Good old fashioned email. Okay, so we'll include it for those who want to reach out. We'll make sure that however you're listening to this, whether it's